Now this slide, yeah, that's on the exam. That is a question. It's going to say select 3 out of vulnerability types. For legacy systems, that's a vulnerability. Out of date, no patches, end of life, firmware hasn't been updated. Virtualization, meaning everything in the cloud. You never updated the cloud infrastructure as a service. You never updated patch management for the virtual server. Yes, of course people are going to get in there. Azure, one of the main vulnerabilities. I went to a little hacking conference here in Las Vegas last year. And I had this hacker show me how they can get into Azure like that fast, into a virtual machine.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? Oh, yeah. That's pretty cool. I was like, pretty cool. Yeah, okay. You also have something that you cannot defend against. If this question comes up on the exam, what is the one thing you cannot defend against and not prepared to? It's a 0 day. You know why I call it a 0 day? Because it happens like on that day, right there. You've never seen it before. So how can you defend against it when you've never seen the characteristics? Next thing about a 0 day is you don't really know if it's remediated or not, do you? Say, for instance, all of us come into work today, because we're all working right now.
Yeah.
I'm working and y'all working the past. We get into Zoom. We're all in Zoom right now. But Zoom starts to act funky. Everybody's dropping calls, everything. Correct, Michael. Contain the system against the 0 day. So now you have to pull the system. So if we're working at Zoom, it's like, okay, something might have gotten to our system, but we don't know the depths. We don't know how far they've gotten. 0 days tell us that it's happening right now, but how long have you been in our system before this even cranked up?
Yeah.
What's the average time that somebody's in your system before you recognize that they're there? What's the industry standard? Somebody give me a guess. You probably know already. I think I said it. What's the average time a hacker or somebody has been in your system before you actually found that they were there? I wish it was 30 seconds. Yep. What's another guess? This is a legacy instantly device, and it's one that might be running an older operating system. The average time, 6 to 8 months. It's not been updated in quite some time, or maybe the middleware that this out. See, there you go. It's the T's got it. The average time, yep. The average time. Maybe at their end of life. Let's say you're wandering around your system like, whoa, this doesn't look right. Yo, we got it. Like somebody's exploiting our stuff. They've already been in your system for 6 to 8 months. You just didn't know it. That's the average time. Yep, they'll be exactly, Mr. T. They're there observing, testing until they strike. They're gathering intel. They're doing group policy or personal policy upgrades to old accounts.
Yeah.
They're navigating over to switch ports and opening ports and establishing applications to be used on it. They've set up remote access terminals. They've found their way. They've done their homework. So by the time they hit you, you don't know where they at. That's why with a real breach, you have to monitor systems again 6 to 8 months after you thought you remediated it. Now you have to keep remediating it and pay it extra attention. Yeah. Now you're spending double the money. It's crazy. It's crazy. So with 0 days, yeah, you just can't fix them on the same day. It may look like you did, but you truly don't know if it's been remediated. Okay. This is how they can exploit you. If you're managing a cloud, you may have situations where virtual machines right here, default configurations. How did that item get shipped to you, and did you ever change anything? What's the first thing you're changing when you get any piece of equipment? Consider also that that these virtual machines may all be built with different configurations.
Password.
These virtual machines
right?
might all have a different number of.
Did we do the exercise yet? We're counting passwords
They have
for.
different capabilities. They might have a different amount
All
of
right,
memory.
let's go down the yellow brick road.
And each one of these systems may be slightly different.
Let's try this.
And of course, these virtual machines do have aspects of the VMs that are very similar to OSs you may be running with other physical devices. So the VM does run a version of
it's going to blow your mind.
Such as Windows or Linux.
First of all, let's delegate this. You see the search bar up here? Here's some shortcuts that you can use. PDF.
But there are some security.
It's going to show me all PDF documents on the internet according to my search.
Vulnerabilities such as a local privilege
Common passwords for Cisco switches.
If you've ever used a VM, you know that VM is its own self-contained system with its own CPU, memory, storage, and other.
Well, look here. It's a PDF controlling switch access. Default password, pass user, Cisco router, PDF. Well, look, let's see what this is.
However, there have been instances where researchers
have
found ways to challenge VMs. This is called a VM.
Cisco router's default passwords.
Access to one virtual machine.
Ain't that crazy?
Find their way to connect to other
model number, there is none. The password is Cisco. Username is Cisco. Password is Cisco. Model number 3600. They use the telnet protocol, so the default is administrator, password is admin.
You would have a great deal of data that you would be able to access. This would obviously
and it just keeps going.
That would allow an attacker
keep going
to many systems simultaneously.
All right.
All of the data contained
now,
within those systems. A practical example of a VM.
Let's see what else we can find.
In March 2017 at the Pwn to Own competition. This is
how about this?
Where if you can pwn the device, then you would be able to physically own it. You get to take that laptop or that computer with you at the end of the contest.
Can you show me subnets?
Were able to use a bug in the JavaScript engine of Microsoft Edge.
Non-published.
Access to a sandbox that's built
PHP
into the Edge browser.
pages.
That sandbox, they were then able to exploit a vulnerability within the Windows 10 kernel. This allowed them to gain full access to that guest operating system. From there, they were able to take advantage of a hardware simulation bug within VMware and hop from one VM to another VM within that same hypervisor. Fortunately, this vulnerability was
nope, that's not what I'm looking for. This is how you do your reconnaissance.
Which allowed
PHP.
time to create a patch, roll
what does
out that
PHP
patch,
pages belong
no
to?
one else can take advantage of this VM.
We learned it this morning.
Another
Aaliyah asked a question about it.
Is a resource reuse. Let's consider what a hypervisor is doing for all of the virtual machines connected to a particular piece of hardware. A hypervisor is managing this relationship between the physical world and the virtual world. So the hypervisor is allocated
PHP, I want some login pages. Let's see what I can find.
Storage and a certain amount of network and CPU access. Although the hypervisor is allocating this amount of resource use for a VM, doesn't mean that VM has access to that particular resource. For example, a hypervisor host may have a total of 4 physical gigabytes of RAM on that.
Sometimes you'll stumble on a hidden page.
Is managing 3 separate virtual machines, and each of the VMs is allocated 2 gigabytes of RAM each. Obviously, the VMs are allocated 6
login pages for colleges.
We have 4 physical gigabytes available for the hypervisor. We're relying on that hypervisor to only allocate memory where it's needed, which would allow us to use effectively 6 gig of storage space on a machine that is only equipped with 4 gigabytes. This means at certain times that there may be certain memory areas that are shared between
database
machines. And it's the sharing.
Let's do this. Try various searches. See what you come up with.
The
SQL.
hypervisor has a bug that doesn't properly allow for the sharing of resources. It is possible.
Login pages.
Write to a memory area, and that memory. This
is all part of reconnaissance, y'all. Y'all just try to do any different. Here we go.
Be the component restricting that sharing of information between VMs. In this example,
let's see what it gives us.
The hypervisor does have some type of memory management issue. Once
let's go deep. Now, just to give you the first 10 pages, which are popular, go deep. Page 10. Oh, look at here. surely we're going to be able to find something here. My ESR, I log in, self-service portal.
And today, practically every organization has one or more applications that they run in a public cloud.
One-stop designation.
Applications, we're putting
Are we getting somewhere here?
The cloud as well.
Mr. T's like, oh, now.
Are often accessing sensitive data.
So,
it's important that we find ways to maintain security.
once we've done our homework here, we've actually found a candidate.
We're not always using the best practices.
You know this website, Amir? What is it?
For example, it's estimated that 76% of organizations aren't even using multi-factor
It's for exporting like geospatial data.
Geospatial data. Where's Kevin at? Geospatial.
It's related to my job, but the people who make maps, they use this.
So you can do your reconnaissance now. Full disclosure, I'm not hacking, I'm looking. We're looking around. At least like I like when you said that. So we learned once before, well, let's see what kind of security you have on here. So you start doing your reconnaissance, you start looking at stuff. DigiCert, SHA-256, CA1, issued on, okay, they have a current cert. It's 2025, public certificate. Okay. Yep. Let's right click and view some page source. Let's see what's going on here. They've designated the type of document that this is, HTML, starts with an exclamation mark, title. Remember, we're looking around.
Configurations are set properly for the app and for the security surrounding that app.
Fast fonts. Ooh, cascading style sheets. I like those. Yeah. Mrs. T's like, yeah. A cascading style sheet is saying I want to use the same format for every page. And of course, if the system is unpatched, an attacker may be able to take. So you just start clicking on stuff and see what comes up. That's what I used to do. And it may be very easy for them to run. Here's some other links. And effectively run any application. PI, that's a subdomain. Not only do we have to make sure that our underlying operating system JavaScript, content delivery network, Dynatrace, that's a link. Geolocation OneTrust. See what this is. Content delivery. And then other systems within that same cloud. A good example of this are the vulnerabilities we found. It may come up and it may not come up. Why wouldn't it come up? Cloud function. These are very easy to exploit. Based off what you learned, and we talk about OWASP and security. Take advantage of these vulnerabilities, and because you effectively have why wouldn't it come up? Afterwards, the rewards for running this exploit make my page. Either you have to log in or you have to credential. You have to have the credential to load the page. Way to go. Right? SAML might be on here. Right? You might have some security on here. So, okay. That's good. So what people generally try to do, here's JavaScript, it's a .js. Looks like it's connected to an object, but again, this is how you snoop around to try to figure out what's going on, or does it lead to a non-indexed subdomain page. All right, so it's just various different things you can do. Then you can start testing this. Look what we got here. Now, JavaScript enabled. It's in a container.
The supply chain involves the process of getting a product from the very beginning raw.
What did we learn about containers?
All the way through to the process of providing that product to a consumer. From a security perspective,
what was the Google search again? The Google search was.
This includes the processing of the raw materials,
oh my gosh, what was it? Let me go back.
Customers and consumers. We know that
y'all remember what we did?
This path, an attacker may be able
to inject. Did I do index pages or non-index pages? ESI something.
Supply chain. This is something we often don't even consider.
I cannot remember what we did to get here.
We generally trust the suppliers of our
not com. Oh, we did database login pages.
We're plugging in.
database, semicolon, login pages. And then we went deep. We didn't go for the first 10 pages. I clicked the 10 page. I'm starting to go way in the internet and see what's there. You might find a vulnerable page. What's this, y'all? Didn't we talk about open auth? An open auth table? Open authorization? They're used when you're using containers or APIs, RESTful APIs, secure links, right? They're using open auth to do that.
If there is an attacker that gains access
sharing
to
files and scripts, so pretty much they got this locked right now.
Access to our sensitive data.
Now there's another tool that you can use.
Numerous service providers. We may have third parties helping us with our network,
and it's in Kali Linux.
Our payroll and accounting services.
It's called NIPCO.
Based infrastructure and so much more. This is
it's used by the DoD. So they have, so if I was just a script kiddie, I'd probably be like, I might pass on this one. Not too much. I'm an amateur. Everything that I've seen so far, they pretty much got it locked down.
For any of your service providers.
Hashes. This page is protected. I'm gonna move on. Now remember, we're just looking around. As long as you don't actively do anything, you're fine.
Specifically,
all right, we're just doing investigation at this point.
Pennsylvania that was infected.
All right,
email that was sent.
And then you can try to crack the database. They even hid.
Clicked on that malicious software, and the attackers now had access to the heating and AC firm. As it turns out, this HVAC vendor was a supplier of the target corporation.
W3 World Wide Web, W3.org is in here.
Unfortunately, the target HVAC network and the target
right there, hidden OAuth. In order to get here, look. Wait a minute. Anywhere you want to go on a page, it'll highlight over here as it corresponds to it.
At every target store. From there, of course, they were able to put malware on every single cash register and begin
JavaScript must be enabled.
Until months later,
it's a container.
From the network.
It's secure. It's a security container that you're going to log into.
We often think of service providers as being only IT individuals, but it's certainly
this is what folks are doing. They're taking advantage of misconfigurations.
Another concern with the supply chain is the hardware itself.
They're snooping around.
A new firewall or a new
software, hardware, cloud.
Pull that device out of the box.
They're looking at crypto.
Perform some configurations, and now it's running.
Is the page secure? Is there a hash with it? Can they get to the hash tables? Is there an algorithm that you can use? Weak keys, shared, pre-shared ciphers? Right? If it's a portable device, they can do what they call side loading on devices, meaning you don't go through the proper channels to buy that device, that app, or download it. It's like Aaliyah came up with, hey, this works good on iPhone. Well, how am I supposed to get it? Well, let's transfer it to Bluetooth. Let's side load it outside the normal channels and install it and develop and promote in Android. What? Yeah. If you're doing that, rooting and jailbreaking are methods used to gain elevated privileges on mobile devices. This is on the test. This is on the exam right here. Rooting and jailbreaking and sideloading. All three of these. Rooting, gain access or administrative privileges on an Android device. Jailbreaking is the same thing, but it's related to iPhone or iPad. And sideloading is installing apps from other sources. To download anything in Android, it's an APK file, Android Application Kit, or Application Package, excuse me. Those files.
This company had sold more than $1 billion of Cisco products.
What they're doing now is, what is F-Droid? F-Droid is an installable catalog, free and open source software applications for Android platforms, which is pretty much sideloading. It's not going through approved devices. Now you gotta look out too, because this little QR code, they've been making fake QR codes too. You might say, yep. They'll put them up saying, hey, come to the concert tonight. and it'll be a fake flyer with a group's name on it. Find out information. As soon as you scan that, it's rooting your phone. It's taking over your files on your phone.
You got a lot of people in Atlanta got boosted in a car once they parked somewhere. They thought they were scanning the QR code of the park, and it was actually going somewhere else.
Yep. So you can rip off a website, take payment. They're paying somebody, but they ain't paying the city of Atlanta. They made it look like a parking page, but it's not really a page. It's a scam. So watch what you're scanning. You'll find yourself in some hot water.
One way to help with that trust is to look at the digital
All right.
signature associated with
Before we go to break, let's check out something.
will validate a digital signature that exists in an update or installation file.
Let's talk about, before we move into our next segment, vulnerability scores. Y'all heard that? Common vulnerabilities scoring system. We talk about that. This gentleman's going to talk about those and what comprises them.
About the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or the CVSS, version 2 and version 3. You might just be the smartest person in the room after today's lesson. We're going to start off here in Tenable, and I'm going to go to the critical vulnerabilities, because in this exercise, we're going to take these vulnerabilities, and I'm going to teach you the Common Vulnerability Scoring System metrics, and then we're going to walk through scoring these vulnerabilities.
Okay. He's using Tenable, which is a vulnerability management, which you can hook up with your C. If you look at this, he's going through here, but it's talking about vulnerabilities, the severity. It's talking about the plugin or what is vulnerable, the state if it's active. He's scanning. Tenable is scanning. He's looking for cloud misconfiguration, host audits, anything. This is basically auditing everything to see what you have in the system, what needs to be taken care of. All right. Now, on the Security Plus exam, you have to score a couple of vulnerabilities, and you have to know this Common Vulnerability Scoring System in order to score them properly or to identify. Okay. So that's what he's going through. We've already walked through MITRE. We went through CVE.org. You know what a vulnerability looks like. So they're taking the example of that, and he's using that to give it a score and showing what charts he's using to do that.
And you're going to understand exactly what these metrics means after this video. I'm going to start with the first one, .NET Core, and I'm going to go to where it says right here. I'm going to zoom in for you. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to this right here, the CVSS vector. This is what we're going to learn today, the CVSS vector.
This line will be on the exam. This line will be on the exam. Okay? Now, they have two versions. This is the CVSS version 2 base score, but now we're up to CVSS version 3. These can be different. As you can see, this one's a little bit longer than this one. All right, just bringing you up to speed.
CVSS V2 and CVSS V3 vectors. Right now, this doesn't mean anything, but in a couple of seconds, this is going to be very clear exactly what this is. To get started with this, I want you to visit the Technology Interpreter's website, because I've already got these linked here for you. In the top right-hand corner, you see Cybersecurity Resources. Click on Cybersecurity Resources. At the bottom of the list, under Vulnerability Management, you see the CVSS V2 and V3 calculators. Click on the V2 calculator, and then go back and click on the V3 calculator. Now, going back to Tenable, let's start with the first part of the CVSS V3 vector. Notice this says AVN, and each one is separated by /, the little line that's leaning to the right, okay? So / and backslash. / leans to the right, backslash leans to the left. Now, if you notice in the CVSS V3 calculator, it says AV. So AV, attack vector, comparing that to Tenable, AV, and then the colon, and then it's what the actual value is. So AV, N. When I go back to the calculator, attack vector, and network. So that tells us this vulnerability is a network-based attack. Let's go to the next metric. AC. L. AC stands for attack complexity. L is low. The complexity of this attack is low. PRN. PR stands for privilege required and no privileges are required. N. UIN. UI stands for user interaction and none is required. N. If it were R, that would mean that user interaction is required. SC. SC is for, first of all, S is for scope and C is for change. S:(C), S:(C), C:(H). C stands for confidentiality, H, high. So the impact to confidentiality, and if you know the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So C, the impact to confidentiality is high. The I:(H), integrity, I, the impact to integrity is high, H, I:(H). A:(H), availability, A, high, A:(H). So by using the CVSS calculator, we just decoded the CVS attack vector so we understand exactly how people can attack us, use it to exploit this vulnerability. So a network attack, once again, that has low complexity, that's privilege required is none, user interaction none, scope has changed, confidentiality impact high, integrity impact high, availability impact high. Let's move on to CVS V2. I'm now in the CVSS V2 calculator. It's a little bit different. The metrics are a little different. And so let's go through the same attack or the same vulnerability using the CVSS V2 metrics. If you notice right here, Tenable, the CVSS vector is here. So AV:(N). AV, access vector, (N). Network, AV:(N). AC:(L). AC, access complexity, L, low, AC:(L). And you can see the access complexity abilities are broken down into high, medium, and low. AU:(N). AU stands for authentication and no authentication or none is required. The choices are multiple and single. If you hover over each one in the calculator, it gives you a description of each of these. C:(C), confidentiality impact, C, complete. So this vulnerability completely impacts confidentiality. I:(C), you should know the pattern now. Integrity, complete, I:(C). The impact on integrity is complete impact. There's a total compromise of the system integrity. There's a complete loss of system protection, resulting in the entire system being compromised. The attacker has the ability, is able to modify any file on the target system. I:(C), integrity impact. A:(C), you figured it out by now. Availability impact. C, complete, A:(C). Choices are partial and none. Okay, so we've now analyzed this one. So let's do a live exercise here. Let's walk through this together. I'm going to present this, and I want you to take a few moments, and I want you to analyze this attack. I'll give you a couple of seconds to get ahead of me, and then I'm going to read through this. And if I were you, I would try to read through this without looking at the guide, without looking at the calculator, because this is pretty easy to remember, but we can always reference it. So AV, CVSS V3, attack vector, right? And I think the trickiest thing to note is some of the terminology used. Access vector, attack vector. Okay, CVSS V3, attack vector, attack complexity. CVSS V2, access vector, access complexity. Access complexity. CVSS V3, privilege is required. CVSS V2, authentication. Okay, so you can kind of see the difference here. So let's go ahead and take a shot at this. Okay, so access, this is CVSS V3, attack vector, network. What's our next one? If we go to 3, attack complexity, AC, low. P, privilege is required, none. User interaction, (R). What does that R stand for? User interaction is required. That's what we talked about before. SU, scope, unchanged. C, confidentiality impact, high. Integrity impact, high. Availability impact, high. Okay, are you starting to get it? All right, now let's look at the CVSS V2 right here. Access, AV, access vector, network, access complexity, low. Let's double check our work here. AC, access vector, network, access complexity, low. All right, So that's pretty good. AU, authentication, none. All right. Confidentiality, impact. And let's look at this. This is confidentiality, impact. There it is right quick. Complete, integrity, impact. Complete, availability, impact. Complete. Don't forget to check out my other video. I'm doing a complete Tenable 2025 series that's going through teaching you vulnerability management. So if you are somebody that's trying to change jobs and get into cybersecurity, maybe you're in 30s, late 30s, 40s, 50s, or older, and you're trying to get into cybersecurity, I'm giving you the tools you need because I am actually, instead of teaching you some generic cybersecurity, this is a tool, Tenable. If you've never heard of this, this is one of the #1 tools in the world, or the #1 tool for vulnerability assessment. This is what most major Fortune companies are using, okay? So I'm showing you this tool. But the thing is, if you really want to learn this, consider joining the Cybersecurity Mentorship Program. I have a link in the description. I'm actually teaching people one-on-one, working with you individually and in group settings to go through it, to fast track your journey into cybersecurity. So if that's interesting to you, then the link below, join the Cybersecurity Mentorship Program.
All right, sounds like a great program. I'll drop the link if that's what you want to do. But he's going over the CVSS score. Now, if you need to put this in your personal library, there's the link. Go ahead and grab that. It's something you want to review before the exam, because they will present you with a string. They're testing on CVSS 3 on this exam. Oh, wait a minute. Had CVSS 3 came out yet? Yes, they are testing on CVSS 3. Yes. So it's a little longer. So they may say, here's a string. What's the attack vector? Well, you know, attack vector is AV. And they're going to say, well, how did they do it? It might be physical entry, in for network, or whatever. You have to identify from a drop down of what it is. Now, with Common Vulnerability Scoring System, it is the initial rating that you're giving it. It can always change. Here's another thing. If Charles has his network and he's in banking, right? And I'm in automotive, I have a car dealership, right? But the common vulnerability and exploit is delivered towards banking institutions. Can his CVSS score be different from mine? Yes. When I go through my system and look at the CVSS, the CVE to score it, my architecture of my network is totally different from Charles. My data is different. I could have low impact on everything and just disregard it. He has to rate high and protect accordingly. But it has nothing to do with me. My life keeps going, but he's not working weekends. Right? So this score can always change. It's very fluid. It's very fluid. All right, so know that for the exam as well. Any questions, y'all?
Installation of unauthorized operating systems or software would be specifically forbidden in the policy procedures of your organization. Usually you'll find this in an employee handbook or a list of acceptable use policies, or AUPs.
Now, if you want the calculator,
this administrative security control to be subject to
here it is from NIST. Michael, as usual. That is the score. That's the page. That's the calculator. On the NIST website.
The applications and operating systems that you're using right now.
Oh, yeah. Got to grade y'all stuff, too. Yeah.
Inside of them.
All right.
The problem is that
let me make sure I do that. Okay, cool. So Common Vulnerability Scoring System Calculator. Please put this in your Rolodex. You'll also have here, you have the base score between 0 to 10.
People all over the world are working to
0 is better than 10, by the way. Temporal score, the environmental, and overall. When you start getting into these different areas, you can hover over, and it would allow you to score it accordingly as it applies to your network in these different areas. Now, as you go through, it will score for you. I'm just clicking stuff.
software,
integrity.
and the
Oh,
vendor of the
low
software has
impact,
no
so
idea
CIA.
this vulnerability even exists.
Right?
This also means there's
When I'm done with all of these,
because from the vendor's perspective,
it will give me
vulnerability has not
a
yet been
score.
discovered. If the attackers then begin exploiting this vulnerability and there's no patch available to mitigate this issue, we refer to that as a zero-day attack. If the security community suddenly realizes there's a new type of attack that no one's seen before, there will suddenly be a flurry of work to create a patch to mitigate that issue.
Right there.
This means until a patch is
See that?
created, the attacker can continue to take advantage of this vulnerability.
As I went through, it was scoring. Here's the string right here. There's the string. As I was going through each area, it put it in a row on how to score it.
In general, you can visit the
All right.
Vulnerabilities and Exposures website, or CVE, at CVE.org.
Here's the, if you're a nerd and you're nerding out on this, here's how they got it.
Attacks that you might find by visiting the CVE website. For example, in April of 2023, the Chrome browser announced a zero-day attack that involved.
It didn't even break it down with the base score, exploitability, temporal,
Microsoft introduced a zero-day
environmental, and overall.
Self-signed code was able to run during the UE.
So this is a very good tool to have. All right.
And also in May 2023,
Everybody got the babies today. Yep, nerd stuff. Charles says we can't have notes, but this is something else. Yeah, it is. It's really good. The higher score is bad.
And the other was an arbitrary code.
She's trying to lock in. She's gonna take the exam for
So it was important for Apple, Microsoft, and
Michael. Now this is 3. They have 3 and 3.1. Now you notice you can look through here. This is how you know. See, I put everything kind of high. Yeah.
Malware is a very broad term.
But good stuff. It's good stuff.
Any type of software that is doing bad things to your system. This may be gathering
Any questions?
keystrokes and sending those keystrokes back to the attacker.
Mike's like, this is too much. What did you just show me? Yeah. Crazy. Big part of the exam though in the domain 2, I believe.
Domain 2.
So we'll go through.
All
right. We'll tell you what. Let's take a break. See you back here at 10 after. Yeah, a lot of questions. Just gotta practice. We'll practice together. See you at 10 after.
That's encrypting all of the data on your storage drives. Or this could be a Trojan horse, where you think you're installing software to perform a particular function, but in reality, that software is installing malware. There's also rootkits, keyloggers, spyware, bloatware, logic bomb, and other categories of malware as well. Regardless of the malware type, all of these different methods can turn your system into a botnet, steal personal data, or encrypt everything that's on your system. We often think of malware as one event or one thing that occurs, but in reality, all of these different types of malware work together to infect your system. For example, you might have a worm that takes advantage of a known vulnerability on your system and automatically installs itself on your storage drive. It might then install additional malware that might have a remote access backdoor, and when the attacker connects to that remote access, they can install additional malware on your system to provide additional capabilities. For this malware to infect your system, it has to somehow find a way to run on your computer. Normally, this would be something that you might click in your email message that then loads the malware into memory and uses the CPU of your system to be able to execute. Or maybe it's a pop-up message that you receive when you visit a website. You might also see when you visit one of these malicious locations that information is automatically downloaded into your system without you clicking on anything. We refer to these as drive-by downloads. And although they are relatively rare, there are still instances where a worm may be able to automatically propagate itself between systems, all by using a known vulnerability. And of course, our computers have vulnerabilities inside of the applications and operating systems, even if those vulnerabilities have not yet been discovered by an attacker or a researcher. And that's why we always tell you to make sure that all of your software is up to date to the latest version. Your operating system probably has updates that are pushed down to your system once a month, and your applications may be configured to automatically update themselves when the developer pushes out a new version. The reason that all of this malware exists is because the data that we own is very valuable. This might be personal data, such as your family archives, your pictures, your family movies, or any important documents that you might have. If this is part of a large organization, then you have planning documents, employee personal information, financial details, and anything else that might be private to that organization. This information may be valuable on its own, or an attacker may find that you're willing to pay them to recover this data after being encrypted. Either way, the data has value, and the attackers want to be able to take advantage of that value. Many malware authors have found an entire business model based around ransomware. This is when they can affect your machine, encrypt all of the data on your computer, and then request you to send them money to be able to receive the decryption key. If you're ever infected with this type of malware, you'll find that all of your personal data is suddenly encrypted. This would include all of your pictures, your movies, any documents, and anything else that might be in your personal folder. Another thing you might find is that the operating system on this computer continues to work normally. That's because the attacker wants you to be able to see the messages they put on the screen about your system being infected, so they want the operating system to continue to work even if all of your data is no longer accessible. The controversial part of ransomware is that the attackers often want money to be able to provide you with the decryption key. Once that cryptocurrency is sent to the attacker, they will send a decryption key and you'll be able to recover your data. This is obviously a very negative form of cryptography, and that's one of the reasons we often tell you to always have a good backup. That way, if you do get infected with ransomware, you can delete everything on that system and restore from your known good backup. An important consideration with these backups is that your backup should be stored offline. That way, if your system is infected with ransomware, the ransomware won't have a way to identify the backup and infect the backup as well. The ransomware may be using a vulnerability in your operating system to be able to install itself, and that's another reason we often tell you to keep your operating system up to date to close those vulnerabilities. This also applies to the applications that are installed on your system. Applications can also have security vulnerabilities, so make sure you're always running the latest version of that app. And hopefully our anti-malware software or antivirus software can recognize this malware before it is infecting your system. This anti-malware or antivirus software identifies this malicious code by using signatures. So it's always important to keep those signatures up to date on your system so that you can block the newest forms of this malware. Having a backup and keeping your system up to date are two of the fundamental best practices for preventing malware and other types of malicious software from running on your computer. Just like a virus inside of the human body, a virus inside of a computer is one that's able to replicate itself from one computer to another. To get this virus to start, it requires some type of intervention, very commonly from a human, to be able to click a link or start an executable. Once the virus is running, it can move through the file system on a computer or try to access other file systems across the network. We commonly associate viruses with some type of outage or downtime, and for the vast majority of viruses, that's probably true. But there are some viruses that sit quietly in the background, and you might not even realize that you're infected. From a user's perspective, a virus is probably one of the most common types of security concerns. And that's why if you look at the operating systems we use today, many of them include or have the option to include an antivirus software. This software is always running on the computer, and it's watching for executables to see if it recognizes software that may have already been identified as malicious. It's one of the reasons we often tell you to always keep your signature file updated in your antivirus, because that's what the antivirus is using to be able to identify this malicious software. There are also different types of viruses. The one we commonly think about is when we click a link or an executable to run this as an application. But there are also viruses that will sit in the boot sector of your system, and when you boot up your computer, the virus automatically runs as the system is booting. Your browser, your operating system, and many applications are able to run scripts, and those scripts can contain malicious software as well. And if you're using an application like Microsoft Office that has the ability to run macros, there are viruses written in that macro language to take advantage of vulnerabilities in that software. There's also a type of virus that doesn't use any files that are stored on your storage systems. This type of virus is a fileless virus because it's never writing any software or any malicious code to your storage drives. And since most antivirus software is also looking for information to be written to a drive, this is one way that the virus can help avoid any of your antivirus software. A fileless virus doesn't install itself as software on your system, and it doesn't require that software to be loaded from your storage drive. Instead, almost everything associated with a fileless virus is occurring in the memory of your system. Here's a very common example of how a fileless virus is able to first infect your system and then from that point install additional malicious software. This usually starts with the end user performing some type of function. So it might be that the user is clicking on a malicious link that's inside of an email or part of an existing website. That link will take the user to a website, and that website is set up to exploit a vulnerability within your operating system or the applications running on your operating system. So exploits associated with Flash, Java, or a known Windows vulnerability would be a perfect way for this fileless virus to get into your operating system. Now that the virus is running on your system, it can run other applications like PowerShell, which then downloads additional PowerShell scripts and runs those scripts in memory as well. At this point, the virus can run additional PowerShell scripts, it can install other applications, it can now start removing data from your system and even transferring that data to a third party. Since this virus is not saving any malicious software to the file system, it needs some way to restart if your system is rebooted. So normally, this type of virus may add an auto start to the registry of your Windows operating system so that the next time you start your system, this process occurs all over again. So far, we've talked about viruses and how the user has to click a link or have some type of interactivity to get that virus running in memory. But there are certain types of malicious software that can run without any user intervention. This malicious software is called a worm. This malware is able to self-replicate itself between systems without any type of user intervention. And obviously these days, most of our systems are networked, which makes it very easy and very efficient for a worm to replicate itself to every system that may be on your network. These worms are replicating themselves at the speed of your network, so an infection with a worm tends to occur very quickly if there's no other type of limiting factor. And since there's no user intervention, these worms are able to attack your systems at any time and move freely about your network. Network-based firewalls and personal firewalls, along with intrusion prevention systems, can make a big difference in identifying and stopping a worm from propagating itself throughout your network. Obviously, these technologies would need to be aware of this type of worm and have signatures and a process in place to be able to stop that traffic from going from one machine to another. Fortunately, worms are a relatively rare occurrence, but let's look at an example of a worm called the WannaCry worm. Not only was this worm able to propagate itself automatically, it also installed ransomware so that it would encrypt and make unavailable all of the user files on these systems. This started with a computer that is infected. That computer then looked across the network to try to find another system that was vulnerable. Once a system is infected, Eternal Blue will install a backdoor, pull down the ransomware code, and infect the machine with that ransomware software. At this point, the worm continues to propagate itself and find all of the vulnerable systems that may exist on this network and infect those also with the same ransomware. If you think your computer may be watching you, you might be right if you're infected with spyware. Spyware is malware that's watching everything that happens on your system. It may be putting advertising on your screen, stealing your personal information, or committing affiliate fraud to earn money from purchases that you make online. Very similar to a typical virus, spyware needs to be installed on your system, either through peer-to-peer software, fake security software, or malicious links that you might get in your email. Spyware is very good at watching everything happening on your systems. It can monitor your browsing habits and send that information back to the attacker's servers. The spyware might also install a keylogger, which is watching everything that you type. This means your usernames, passwords, and everything else you type on the system is collected into a file, and that file is sent to the attacker's server. Fortunately, most of us are running anti-malware or antivirus software that is looking for this type of spyware to be installed on your system, and if it recognizes that spyware is there, it will stop it from executing. It's also a good idea to research everything that you might be installing on your system. Each installation is an opportunity for malware to install itself on your system, so you should always make sure that you're using known, good, and trusted software. This malicious spyware code works very hard to embed itself within your operating system, and some versions of spyware make it very difficult to uninstall. This is why it's always a good idea to have a known good backup, so that if your system is infected with malware, you can easily recover from that backup. And of course, you may want to look for this malware with third-party software like Malwarebytes, which is specifically designed to look for malware running on your system. Not only can Malwarebytes and similar software identify the spyware, in many cases it can remove it from your system as well. Another challenge is managing bloatware. If you've ever purchased a new computer or a new mobile device and you've turned it on for the first time, you'll notice there are a lot of popular apps that may already be installed on that system, such as your mail and your browser and other things that you would commonly expect. But it might also include applications that you didn't expect. There may be a number of applications, security tools, games, and other apps that normally would not be installed with a core operating system installation. Instead, these utilities and other applications are installed by the manufacturer of the hardware. Normally, the hardware manufacturer is getting paid to include this software on these systems that they're distributing. And of course, you, the end user, are left with what is probably a number of unnecessary applications already installed onto this new device. There are a number of security concerns associated with bloatware. Obviously, it's going to take up room on a storage device that could be allocated to other applications. The system may be running some of this software automatically when it starts up, and that could be affecting the overall efficiency of the operating system. And of course, any of these applications could be susceptible to a known or unknown vulnerability, making this a security concern on a device that's brand new out of the box. Obviously, one way to deal with this bloatware is to manually remove it from your system. Unfortunately, not all bloatware provides an obvious way to uninstall. Hopefully, the bloatware is listed in the installed applications of your operating system, and you may be able to select it, click the uninstall button, and remove it from your computer. Other apps might have their own uninstaller that you have to run from the program area for that particular application or in the start menu of your Windows operating system. It's become such a challenge to uninstall software that there's even third-party software designed to uninstall other third-party software. This is probably not the first place you should go to uninstall the software, but it may provide you with a way to remove that code when nothing else seemingly is able to work in that operating system. This may not be the first choice for uninstalling this bloatware, but occasionally it can help remove software when no other process seems to be working. Attackers know that a great deal of sensitive information is put into your computer using the keyboard. So this would be a great place to perform key logging and capture every keystroke that you make when you're typing something into your PC. This might include all of the website URLs you visit. It could be passwords and usernames. It might be credit card information and other financial details, and anything else that you might type into your system. Keylogging malware will stay resident on your system. It will capture all of these keystrokes to a file, and usually once or more times a day, that file will be sent to the attackers so that you now have a record of everything you typed into your computer. We often talk about protecting the data sent across our network by using encryption or VPNs. Sometimes we'll discuss storing files in encrypted form using full disk encryption or single file encryption. But the attackers know that if you
take the
type
next
in
hour or
something
so
into
and
the keyboard,
discuss
that process is
and
not
jump into
encrypted.
our
It's the perfect
assignments.
place to capture your username and password
The
or
illustrious
your credit card
assignments.
number. This keylogging software can do a lot more than simply capture your keystrokes. They can be used to capture the information that you store in a clipboard. Maybe they take screenshots of what you have on your screen at any particular time, store that information. There may be instant messages or chats that can be stored as part of the keylogger, and maybe anything that you search in a search engine query can all be logged, stored, and sent to an attacker with this keylogging software. This is keylogging software that's included with a utility called Dark Comment. Dark Comment is a RAT, or a remote access Trojan. It's malicious software that an attacker can use to capture your keystrokes, screenshots, and other information from your computer. On the left side is a notepad where I typed in username, Professor Messer, and a password of not a real password. And then I show you the keylogger on the right side that has captured all of this information. It captured what I typed, when I typed it. It even recognized when I put in a space and then used a delete key so that I can make that all one single word. The keylogger captures everything, stores it in a file, and that file is occasionally sent to the attacker. Another type of malicious software is a logic bomb. A logic bomb is waiting for a particular event to occur, and when that event occurs, the bomb is then detonated on that system. This might be waiting for a particular date and time, and when that date and time arrives, the system then reboots, erases data, or makes changes to that system. Or this may be something related to what the user is doing. Maybe we're waiting for a particular user to log in, and as soon as that user logs in, the bomb then executes. Logic bombs are usually something created by an end user or created by someone who has a particular goal in mind. And because of that, it's not malware that we've seen run on another system, so there generally is not an antivirus or anti-malware signature associated with a logic bomb. This makes a logic bomb very difficult to identify, but there are monitoring tools that you can put into a system to look at key files and make sure that no one has modified or changed anything associated with those critical operating system files. An example of a logic bomb creating a problem for an organization occurred on March 19th of 2013 in South Korea. A malicious email was sent to banks and broadcasting companies that had an attachment, and if that attachment was run, it installed a Trojan onto the user's computer. A day later, on March the 20th of 2013, at 2 p.m. local time, the logic bomb activated based on that time of day. When it activated, it deleted everything that was in storage and the master boot record of the system where the Trojan was installed. The system was then rebooted, but of course the operating system had just been deleted, so when the system started up again, there was no operating system to start. Because this Trojan was sent to a bank, a number of the systems within the bank were affected by this logic bomb, but perhaps none more important than the automatic teller machines associated with the bank. These were also infected by this logic bomb, and on March 20th at 2 p.m. local time, all of the ATMs were deleted and also rebooted to no operating system on those ATMs. If you tried to use the ATM after the system was rebooted, you saw a message that said, "Boot device not found. Please install an operating system on your hard disk." As I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to identify where a logic bomb may have been installed because there are no known signatures that you can use to try to identify them. There are things you can do within the normal processes and procedures of your organization. For example, you may have a series of processes and procedures that limits the change of any core operating system files. And you may set up monitoring that can identify when any of these files may have been changed, which might give you a heads up that something has been modified that could be a logic bomb. This is also another good idea to perform constant monitoring to make sure that every user in your organization only has the rights and permissions necessary for that user to do their job. The days of having everyone run as administrator rights are over, primarily because of the security concerns that can be based around that issue, and certainly because someone with additional rights and permissions could easily install a logic bomb. Another security concern you may have heard of is a rootkit. The name root in rootkit comes from the Unix superuser of root, very similar to the administrator that would be in a Windows environment. A rootkit generally hides itself in the kernel of the operating system. This makes it part of the OS itself, which means it's very difficult to identify this rootkit with traditional antivirus or anti-malware software. When the rootkit is running, it's running as part of the operating system, so you probably won't see it listed if you tried to list out all of the tasks or processes on this particular computer. Instead, it simply is part of the OS, and anything the operating system is doing will include the malicious code that's part of this rootkit. And since this rootkit is effectively invisible to your antivirus or anti-malware software, it has full run of your computer. Not all rootkits are part of the kernel, and if they are running as a traditional process in your operating system, you still might be able to identify it with anti-malware software. If you believe your system has been infected with a specific type of rootkit, there are a number of standalone rootkit removal tools that are specific to different rootkit variants. Obviously, this is something you would use after you would become infected, so it may not prevent the rootkit from causing problems, but it may be able to remove the rootkit so you can perform some type of mitigation of your personal files. In order to combat these rootkits, we've created processes within the UE5 BIOS called Secure Boot. Secure Boot will look for an operating system signature and confirm that nothing has changed with the kernel of that operating system before the system is booted. This means that even if the rootkit does manage to get installed, your system will stop this rootkit from running when it boots up, and effectively preventing that rootkit from causing any additional problems on your system. In this course, we've talked a lot about technology and how attackers can circumvent different aspects of our operating systems and digital technologies. But of course, there is a type of security concern that has nothing to do with the technology that we use. That would be a physical attack. With a physical attack, we're not interested in the version of operating system that we're running or concerned about a particular type of vulnerability. Instead, we're going to attack this problem at the physical level. Just as there are many ways to attack the digital security of a system, there are also many ways to attack the physical security of those same systems. Whenever we think about ways to protect a system, we always need to consider the physical aspect. This is because someone with physical access to a computer can also get full control to that system. If someone can physically touch that computer, then they can also circumvent the operating system that's running on that computer. It's often said that door locks only keep out the honest people, so we may have to include additional tools to be able to maintain the physical security of our devices. Brute force is a term that we often associate with password discovery, but brute force can also be a very useful physical attack. If there's a locked door or a locked window, we can use brute force to be able to force that door open or force access into that window. You might want to try evaluating this with your data center. How difficult would it be to use brute force to gain access through doors or windows that would ultimately provide an attacker with access to your entire infrastructure? Attackers will try anything to gain access to your data, and it wouldn't be unusual for an attacker to try to find a way through a locked door or locked window to gain access to those important resources. Another useful physical attack is RFID cloning. We use RFID very often for access through doors. So access badges and key fobs commonly have RFID as the underlying technology. If we were able to clone or duplicate someone's existing access badge, we would effectively have full control over exactly the same areas that they do. This is a lot easier than you might think. You can look on Amazon for RFID cloners, and the duplicators available can be purchased for less than $50 US. This is also a duplication process that happens very quickly. Simply read one card and immediately copy it to another card in just a matter of seconds. And there have been documented cases where someone was able to use an RFID reader on something like a train on the way to work, brush up against someone with an access key, and you've now got a duplicate of their access card. This is another reason why multi-factor authentication is so useful. Even if someone has duplicated the card, they don't know your personal identification number, they don't have access to your biometrics, and therefore they would not gain access to those resources. If you can't attack the systems directly, perhaps you can attack the environment around the systems. And there are many ways to go about performing an environmental attack. One very common environmental attack is to simply turn off all of the power in a data center. An attacker may be able to do this from outside the building, which means they would not need any special access inside of the doors. Instead, they can take care of this particular attack from outside. We've also seen that HVAC systems tend to have a lower priority for security than other parts of your infrastructure. So if an attacker does gain access to an HVAC control system, they might decide to turn off the cooling have all of the systems heat up, and then they would automatically shut down once they reached a certain temperature. And in some data centers, the fire suppression system sets off another series of events, and someone who gains access to the fire suppression system may also be able to cause a denial of service. A denial of service occurs when an attacker forces a service to fail. This is an intentional process where the attacker may be overloading a service so that no one else can gain access. Or the attacker may be taking advantage of a known vulnerability or design failure with that particular system. This is another reason why we always say to keep your systems always up to date with the latest patches. There are also documented cases where an organization may create a denial of service to a third party as a competitive advantage. If you can remove your competitor from the internet, then there's an obvious advantage to be had. And it may be that the denial of service is simply a distraction or a smokescreen so that some other vulnerability can be exploited elsewhere in the organization. And although it's true that sometimes this denial of service occurs because of a vulnerability in software, sometimes it's a very easy process. For example, removing the power from a system is a very simple way to create a denial of service situation. Sometimes we create a denial of service to ourselves. This can be easily done if you aren't paying attention. For example, you may be plugging in two switches to each other, and then you plug those two switches into each other again, which effectively creates a loop. And if you're not running spanning tree, then you've probably brought down that particular part of the network, creating a denial of service. You could also create a denial of service by simply downloading a file. For example, if you need to download a large Linux distribution and all you have is a very small DSL line, you may be using all of the bandwidth that would normally be associated with your production applications. And I have worked for organizations where the water line was placed above the ceiling of the data center, and unfortunately, that water line broke. This certainly caused panic for everyone in the IT department, and it also caused a denial of service. The attackers, though, don't count on one single device to try to bring down an entire set of servers. Instead, they will use multiple devices located all over the world to create a distributed denial of service, or DDoS. For example, they may use a large number of computers scattered all over the world to use up all of the bandwidth or resources associated with a web server, which would effectively cause this denial of service issue. Obviously, the attacker is not sitting at the workstation of all of these devices that are located all over the world. Instead, they put malware on these devices and created a series of botnets. These are robot networks that are under the control of the attacker, and the attacker can simply tell the botnet in one single command to attack a particular web server. As an example of just how prevalent this can be, the Zeus botnet had over 3.6 million computers under their control at their peak. This allowed the owner of the botnet to basically attack any device or any system that they would like, all by sending a single command to their botnet. We sometimes refer to this as an asymmetric threat because the attacker has relatively few resources and they can easily bring down organizations that have many more systems and much more bandwidth than they do. The attackers have also found that they can create a much more efficient attack if they can send large amounts of data to these devices to effectively bring them down even faster. And the attackers have found that there are ways that they can send small amounts of data that are suddenly amplified into very large amounts of data to cause the denial of service. This process of reflecting and amplifying the amount of traffic being sent over the network is possible because they're taking advantage of internet services that are available to anyone. You can see this amplification occur with certain protocols. For example, when you request information from an NTP server, you generally receive back more information than you requested. The same thing applies to DNS requests, ICMP requests, and other types of very common protocols. Here's a very common example of DNS amplification. This is a DNS query. You can see the dig command. This dig command is requesting any information over a particular domain name, and the domain they'd like to find is isc.org. So you're sending very little information out, only 15 characters. But notice that the results of what's returned is about 1,300 characters. or you're effectively amplifying this by about 86 times. You can see how this might be appealing for an attacker because they can use DNS service, which is very common, send very little information into the DNS, and have the victim receive a large amount of information in return. Here's how this would work. You have a command and control for the botnet that is managed from a central facility, and of course you have all of these infected systems around the world that make up the botnet. It's also important for the attacker to find just the right DNS servers, the ones that are not properly configured or properly secured. These are open DNS resolvers. There may be a number of these that the attacker can use located around the world. This starts with the botnet command and control sending the command to the botnet to start the distributed denial of service attack. This is sent as a message that says, perform a query on the open DNS resolvers that are listed and have that query spoofed so that the results are being sent to a particular web server. This query is sent from all of the botnet devices to these DNS resolvers. And of course, because this is amplification, the query that's made is relatively small, but the results from the DNS resolver will be much larger. These DNS resolvers will send these responses to the web server IP address that was originally spoofed, effectively overwhelming it and causing the distributed denial of service attack. We rely on our domain name services, or our DNS servers, to provide us with a conversion between a fully qualified domain name and an IP address. An attacker taking advantage of a number of different DNS poisoning attacks could cause a user to visit an IP address that they did not originally intend. Some of these DNS poisoning attacks involve modifying the DNS server itself. The DNS servers themselves are very well protected, so this is not the kind of attack that is commonly used when you think of DNS poisoning. Something that might be a little more accessible to the attacker would be to modify the host files on the client computer. They would need to have access to this client computer, and in most cases they would need elevated rights to even have permission to change this file. This local host file contains a list of fully qualified domain names and IP addresses very similar to what you would find on a DNS server. But instead of your local machine querying the DNS server for this information, it simply looks through its local host file to see if the resolution happens to be in that file itself. And if it is in the file, it uses that resolution instead of making a query to the DNS server. And there are certainly ways for an attacker to sit in the middle of a conversation, intercept the DNS queries, and reply back with the query that would direct the user to a malicious site. Since this is a real-time redirection of the original request, it would require the attacker to sit in the middle of the conversation as the DNS query is occurring. Let's look at an example of when an attacker can gain access to the DNS server to modify that DNS configuration. Here's how this DNS poisoning that's using IP spoofing is able to redirect this traffic. We have an attacker on this network. This is an attacker that has an IP address of 100.100.100.100. We also have a DNS server. Its IP address is listed here as 162.159.246.164. And then there are two users on the network that need to query for ProfessorMesser.com. A normal DNS query without any type of attacker sitting in the middle of the conversation would occur from user 1, who talks directly to the DNS server and queries for ProfessorMesser.com. That DNS server has a record in that server that indicates that ProfessorMesser.com is the IP address you see here that ends in 164. So the DNS server will send an answer back to the first user with the IP address of ProfessorMesser.com, and that user fills in that information in their cache, and they can continue connecting to ProfessorMesser.com using the IP address they discovered during the resolution process with the legitimate DNS server. Now let's say that there is an attacker on the network who has somehow gained access to this device that contains the DNS server. Maybe they've been able to identify a known vulnerability, gain access to the operating system, or maybe they've been able to obtain administrative credentials for this DNS server. In either case, the attacker can connect directly to the DNS server, modify the DNS server configuration, so instead of it pointing to the .164 address for ProfessorMesser.com, the new IP address for ProfessorMesser.com is now the same as the attacker, or 100.100.100.100. This means that any subsequent requests made to the DNS server, for example, from user 2, will result with a response from the DNS server that doesn't contain the correct IP address. Instead, user 2 will receive the IP address that has been changed by the attacker, or 100.100.100.100. This means that any subsequent request to ProfessorMesser.com from user 2 will go to 100.100.100.100, or the attacker's computer, instead of going to the legitimate IP address for the Professor Messer website. Another way to gain access to this DNS server and make configuration changes is to somehow gain access to the entire fully qualified domain name that is used by that DNS server. So if you can access the domain registration wherever it happens to be, you would then be able to control exactly where that traffic is going to flow and what IP addresses might be associated with that fully qualified domain name. There are many ways to gain access to this domain registration. It is not a simple process because of the security that's generally put in place at these domain registrars, but there are ways to gain access to these accounts through traditional means, such as brute force, social engineering the password, perhaps finding a username and password from credentials that were released publicly on the internet, or any other method that allow us to gain access to the username and password for this account. If an attacker was to gain access to this domain registration, they would be able to make any changes to the IP addresses for the DNS settings associated with that fully qualified domain name. An example of this happening occurred on Saturday, October 22nd, 2016 at 1 p.m. There were 36 domains that were changed in the domain registration settings. This was associated with a bank in Brazil, and it modified the domains that were used by desktop systems, mobile devices, and almost any other device associated with the bank. The attackers had access to all of these systems and were able to make configuration changes for a 6-hour period on that weekend. The attackers effectively became the IP address for the entire bank, which means they could start collecting usernames and passwords and other sensitive financial data. The bank didn't release any information about this particular attack, but we know that this bank has over 5 million customers and approximately $27 billion in assets. This is a problem that can occur not just for this bank, but for anyone's organization where you rely on that DNS to point people to the correct servers instead of a server that may be malicious. Another way that an attacker can use to redirect users to a malicious site is by using URL hijacking. This might redirect users to a site that presents advertising, and that advertising would create a revenue stream for the attacker. Or maybe the attacker has the name of a domain that is very close to the actual domain name, and the attacker may be able to sell this misspelled domain name to the legitimate domain name owner. If the attacker really wanted to be crafty, they could use that misspelled name to redirect all the traffic from that legitimate site to the competitor of that legitimate site. Or the attacker may present a page that looks exactly like the legitimate site, and it may request you to input your username and password, at which point the attacker now has your login credentials. Or the attacker wants you to download malicious software that will either create a ransomware for your machine, or it will turn your device into part of a much larger botnet. Sometimes you'll hear this URL hijacking referred to as typo squatting or brand jacking.
Everybody doing okay out there?
That are made on the keyboard of users
in virtual land? Yes.
Sometimes this is just a misspelling of the original domain name, and you may not even notice that the domain name is different. For example, the legitimate URL for my website is ProfessorMesser.com with ProfessorMesser.
All right, so let's say 4:45 or 5, I will be holding a 12:01 study hall. 12:01 Core 1 study hall.
Sorry, sir. What time was the 12:01 going to be?
At 5.
Type in the domain name, but accidentally leave off the last S. This means the user would be directed to a domain name that is owned by the attacker rather than the legitimate ProfessorMesser.com. Attackers could also add additional letters to the domain name. For example, ProfessorMessers.com, which looks very close to the legitimate domain name, but of course this is a domain name that is owned by the attacker. Or they might use the same name in the first part of the domain, such as Professor Messer, but instead of using .com, they'll register that same domain with a different top-level domain, such as .org. This is another reason why we often tell you not to click links inside of your email and to look very closely at the domain that you're visiting to ensure that you're really on the correct website. Let's say you're on a wireless network browsing the internet and then suddenly you're disconnected from the wireless network. There's no warning, no messages, you've simply dropped off the network and now you no longer have internet access. So you wait a bit, you reconnect to the wireless network, you go back to surfing, and then the wireless network drops off again. This is something that can happen over and over and over again, and you may not be able to even stop it from occurring. Anyone on this wireless network could be susceptible to a wireless deauthentication attack. This is a denial of service that takes people that are working normally on the wireless network and then suddenly disconnects them completely from any connectivity over that network. The main vulnerability associated with this deauthentication attack relates to the management frames that are sent and received by the access point. These are frames that normally we don't see happening. They're all going back and forth between your device and the access point behind the scenes. But they're used to connect your device to the network, manage its connection, and then disconnect it when you're done using the network. Each time you bring up a list of the access points you want to connect to, or you authenticate or deauthenticate from an access point, it's using these management frames to provide that functionality. Unfortunately, earlier versions of the 802.11 specification did not provide any security for these management frames. They're sent across the network in the clear, there's no encryption of these frames, and therefore an attacker could manipulate these frames in order to cause problems for people on that network. I took a packet capture of traffic that's on my 802.11 network, and I pulled up one of many different types of management frames. One thing you'll notice immediately is that everything on this page is all in the clear. Nothing is encrypted. So anyone who's close to this access point can view all of this information. This happens to be an 802.11 radio information frame. You can see the receiver address, the destination address, the transmitter address, and other details relating to the device itself. Then you can see the parameters for that device. The SSID for this wireless access point is PMN, that's the name of the wireless network. You can see the support rates for that network and other details associated with that wireless access point. Let's look at an example of a deauthentication attack. I have an attacker's screen on the right side in black, and you can see the user or victim's device is on the left side. For this attack to work, we need to know the MAC address or hardware Wi-Fi address of the device we'd like to remove from the network. In this case, it's the user's iPhone, and this iPhone's MAC address ends with 2 Echo Fox Delta. We're first going to run a utility called aerodump-ng, and we're going to specify the wireless card that we're using for this Linux device, which in this case is WLAN 0mod. When we run this command, you'll notice that we have a listing of all of the access points in this area. This one is listed with the VSS ID, and you can see the ESS ID associated with that address. I also have a list of all of the devices that are communicating to that wireless access point, and you'll notice that the last one in the list ends in 2 Echo Fox Delta, and that matches the Wi-Fi address of this iPhone. Now that we have the hardware addresses for the wireless access point and the device that we'd like to remove from the network, let's run a command to send some deauthentication frames across the wireless network. We'll use this utility airreplay-ng and specify a -0 to send the deauthentication frames. Then we'll select the wireless access point's hardware ID and then the device that we'd like to remove from the network with its MAC address. Then we'll begin the air replay, and you'll notice the PM network on the left side suddenly disappears when the deauthentication frames are sent across the network. As long as we continue sending these deauthentication frames, this particular device will not be able to reconnect to this wireless network. The engineers on the IEEE 802.11 committee realized that this particular problem is a significant security concern, and they made updates to the specification to prevent this from occurring in the future. These updates were incorporated into the 802.11 AC standard and newer. With this update, a number of management frames are now encrypted. So frames such as the disassociate, the authenticate, and channel switch announcements are now encrypted by default, would no longer be susceptible to this type of denial of service attack. If you perform a packet capture on your 802.11 AC network or newer, you may still see management frames that are not encrypted. This is because there are a number of important management frames that have to be in the clear prior to the encryption occurring. So things like beacons, probes, authentication, and association frames are frames that you might still see if you take a packet capture. The DAuth attack took advantage of a vulnerability within the 802.11 protocols themselves, but there are other ways to prevent someone from connecting to a wireless network using radio frequency or RF jamming. This is a type of denial of service attack that affects not just a single device, but everyone trying to communicate over those wireless frequencies. The attackers will send interfering wireless signals to anyone who may be nearby. The goal is to have them decrease the signal to noise ratio so that the user is hearing more noise than actual real data from the wireless access point. And of course, if your device can't hear anything being sent by the wireless access point, then it's not able to send or receive traffic and communicate over that network. You may have even done this yourself without realizing what was happening. It's very common, for example, for microwave ovens to cause problems with 2.4 gigahertz wireless networks, and sometimes fluorescent lights can also cause jamming over these wireless frequencies. But if you're not running into a problem with an oven or with your lights, then it is possible that someone is sending additional signals out to cause problems on your wireless network. There are many different ways for an attacker to cause this type of jamming. They could send a constant amount of information, they could send random data across the network, or they might send a large number of legitimate frames over this wireless network. All of this would cause noise and problems for people that were trying to communicate to this access point. The attacker might also send data at random times to make the troubleshooting of this problem a little more difficult. And this might be more of a reactive jamming. Normally, when the network is quiet, there's no jam signal to see, but as soon as someone tries to communicate with the access point, the attacker turns up the volume and makes it impossible for anyone to communicate on this wireless network. Just like the deauthentication attack, someone performing wireless jamming needs to be local to that access point. So somewhere nearby is the user that's causing these wireless jamming problems. You just need to hunt them down and turn off the jam signal. Amateur radio operators often refer to this as a fox hunt. The fox hunter will often use a directional antenna that can be used to move around to locate exactly where a signal may be coming from. As you get closer to the signal, it becomes much louder. It's difficult to know exactly what direction it's coming from, so a good fox hunter may also have an attenuator that will lower the signal strength and make it easier to tell what direction any signal might be coming from. Using these techniques, you can eventually narrow down and triangulate exactly where a signal may be coming from, and hopefully locate where a signal jam may be occurring on your network. An on-path attack allows an attacker to sit between two devices and watch all of the traffic go back and forth between those systems. You might have also heard this attack referred to as a man-in-the-middle attack. The attacker in the middle of the conversation is responsible for transferring information from one device to the other. And as it's passing through, the attacker can look at the information that's being sent between devices and in some cases modify the information that's being sent in real time as it's traversing the network. What's perhaps even more concerning, especially for the parties involved, is they have no idea this attack is taking place. The on-path attack is effectively invisible for the victim devices. One type of an on-path attack is ARP poisoning. ARP poisoning occurs on a local IP subnet, so the attacker would need to be on the same subnet as the victim devices. Because ARP doesn't have any type of security or encryption associated with it, this is a relatively easy attack to implement. Let's see how an attacker might use ARP poisoning or ARP spoofing to be able to monitor traffic between two devices. The two devices the attacker would like to monitor is this laptop and this router. The laptop has an IP address of 192.168.1.9 and a MAC address that ends in 38 Delta 5. The router has an IP address of 192.168.1.1 and its MAC address ends in Bravo, Bravo, Fox, Echo. When the laptop first connects to the network, it doesn't know the hardware address of the router. All it has is the IP address of the router, but of course our devices communicate by MAC address. It's the Address Resolution Protocol, or ARP, that allows us to resolve the MAC address from an IP address. So the first thing the laptop will do is send a broadcast across the network asking if any device out there happens to be 192.168.1.1, and if you are this device, please send back your MAC address. The router will obviously see this broadcast and will send back a response that says, I am 192.168.1.1, and here is my entire MAC address. You can see the MAC address here is the same as the MAC address already associated with this router. Once the laptop receives that ARP reply, it saves that reply into a cache on this local device. This allows the laptop to continue to communicate to the router without having to perform this ARP request over and over again. The ARP cache will normally time out after a number of minutes, at which time the ARP process will occur again. It will be cached again, and it will be saved locally for the next interval. Now we have our attacker. Our attacker is an IP address of 192.168.1.14, and you can see that the MAC address of the attacker ends in Echo, Echo, Fox, Fox. This laptop already has the MAC address of the router saved in the cache, and there's not been a subsequent request to update that ARP information, but the attacker sends an ARP response anyway that says that I am 192.168.1.1, and my MAC address ends with Echo, Echo, Fox, Fox. You'll notice that is identical to the MAC address associated with the attacker. ARP doesn't have any type of authentication function or additional security, so when it receives this type of message, it will update its cache with this new detail. So you can see the ARP cache has now been overwritten with the 192.168.1.1 and the new MAC address of Echo, Echo, Fox, Fox. This same process will...
All right, so let's go ahead, get 10 minutes in. When we get back, I will crack open a NetBus study hall. Those that want to pop in. We're doing Q&A style. And then me and Leah primarily be running at 5. We'll pivot to a 12:01 room for an hour to try to fit something in. All right. So we're just trying to use our best use of our time to try to accommodate a lot of different people trying to do a lot of different things. Makes sense? All right, so we'll see what we can do. Hang in there, Mike. I see you. Yep, hang in there.
On this device is configured as a proxy that is able to redirect traffic before and after it's sent to the network. This means that even if the network traffic was encrypted, this type of attack would still be able to see all of the information in the clear because it's running on the same device as the victim. And of course, because it's an on-path attack, everything looks normal to the victim device. Now the malware waits for you to log into something important like your bank account and captures all of the information that you sent to the bank, including your username, your password, and other credentials. Once you open up your browser and connect to your bank with the username and password, the attacker now has all of the information they need on your device to start other sessions behind the scenes that you as the victim would never see. These sessions may be transferring data from one account to another, spending your money at an online shopping site, or any other location that requires a username and password that has now been captured by the on-path browser attack. A common flow of network traffic is from a client to send information to the server and the server to reply with additional details. Some of this information that's being sent back and forth between the client and the server may contain information that an attacker would love to be able to see and to be able to collect. Once that information is collected, the attacker may be able to reuse that information with a replay attack. To be able to perform a replay attack, the attacker has to be able to have information that can be replayed. This can be difficult for the attacker to obtain. Some of the techniques they might use would be to use a physical network tap to watch the traffic, perhaps use ARP poisoning to redirect traffic to the attacker, or the attacker may put malware on the victim's computer to be able to gather information going across the network. Once the attacker has these details, they can replay this back to the server, effectively posing as the victim computer. The replay itself is not an on-path attack, although it is very common to perform an on-path attack to gather the details that later will be used for a replay attack. One form of a replay attack is called pass the hash. The hash in this context refers to a password hash that is normally used during the authentication process. This starts with the client or the victim computer sending a normal authentication request to a server. During that process, the attacker has put in place a way to redirect or get a copy of that traffic also sent to the attacker's computer. So effectively, they're capturing a username and a hashed password, which is identical to the username and hash password being sent to the server. Once the attacker has this information, they can replay the username and hashed password back to the server, posing as the original client. The server receives a username and hashed password that properly authenticates, so the attacker now has access to the server, posing as the victim computer. One way to stop this replay attack from occurring is to use encryption so that none of the traffic sent across the network can be seen. And this also might include some additional salting of the password so that each time an authentication occurs, it's using a different salt and therefore a different hash. The server is configured to not accept the same hash twice in a row, so if the attacker does somehow gain access to this salted hash, they wouldn't be able to use a replay attack to gain access to the server. Another valuable piece of information that an attacker would love to retrieve from your computer are your browser cookies. These cookies are simply files that store information about the sites that you visit. This is a way for your browser to maintain tracking and session management when you're connecting to websites. The cookie is not an executable and it doesn't contain any malicious code, but it does contain information that would be valuable for an attacker to gain access to a server. This could also be a privacy risk. If you look through the information that's contained in the cookies stored in your browser, there's username information, other details about the connection, and things that a third party could use to learn more about you. The information that an attacker would love to pull out of these cookies, though, would be a session ID. This session ID could be used by an attacker to gain access to a server without needing any login credentials from the victim. The session hijacking or sidejacking occurs when a user authenticates initially with a web server. So they provide a username and password, and a session ID is sent back to the victim's computer. If the attacker does gain access to the session ID, they can use it for subsequent sessions to the web server. And every time they use this session ID, the web server thinks it's coming from the original victim's computer, which is now logged in, and the attacker would now have access to everything the victim machine would have on that web server. The session ID and many other details are contained within the headers that are sent back and forth between systems. These headers could be gathered using some type of packet capture, such as Wireshark or Kismet. There are also exploits like cross-site scripting that can gather these details on a client machine and have those details sent to the attacker. The attacker might also modify the headers that they're sending to a victim server. And through the years, we've used tools like Tamper, Firesheet, and Scaping to be able to accomplish this. There are also a number of add-ons and extensions you can put in your browser to be able to view your cookies and modify the information that's contained within those cookies. One way to prevent this session hijacking is to simply encrypt everything. If you're encrypting from the source device and all of that data is encrypted all the way until you reach the destination device, anyone monitoring this traffic would not be able to see any of your session IDs or any other personal information. This requires the server to be configured to allow encryption using HTTPS, and these days many servers are already configured to allow this type of encryption. There are also extensions that you can enable in your browser that will require that the connection between you and a web server is running HTTPS, and it will prevent any type of access that may be in the clear. If you can't encrypt end-to-end, you might want to encrypt from your device to a VPN concentrator. That would at least allow for encryption on the first part of the journey, and the only part that would be in the clear is the part that is after the VPN concentrator. As As we've already discussed in this course, attackers have many things they can do to try to gain access to your systems. They might use social engineering to trick you into giving up access to an area or using a password. Or they might try to use default credentials that unfortunately may not have been changed on newly installed equipment. And of course, misconfigurations can easily leave a door open for an attacker to walk right into your network. These attacks may require some knowledge of the organization or of the users, but they're not solely technical attacks. Logging in with default credentials or misconfigurations are errors that were left by the user and don't require a huge amount of technical know-how. But if the users are not susceptible to social engineering techniques and the device has not been misconfigured or left with the default credentials, then the attacker needs some other method to gain access to those systems. Instead of walking in an open door that was left unlocked because of default credentials, malicious code requires a bit more technical know-how. And in this video, we'll look at some of the techniques that attackers use with malicious code to gain access to your network. When we mention malicious code, we are really referring to many different methods that could be used to gain access to these systems. This malicious code could be packaged in an executable. There could be scripts that are running on that system. There might be macroviruses or Trojan horses or many other methods of malicious code that can gain access to the system. Because there's so many different methods that could be used, we have to present a very strong defense against any possibility of malicious code. So we might be using anti-malware to block executables, perhaps some scripts or macroviruses. We have a firewall to block traffic that may be known malicious passing through your network. We have continuous updates and patches that will always close these vulnerabilities if a security issue does exist. And of course, we need to train our users to use secure computing habits so that they don't give people information over the phone or click unknown links inside of an email. Malicious code was used with the WannaCry ransomware attacks to infect devices that were Windows systems that had a vulnerability using SMB or Server Message Block version 1. This vulnerability allowed for arbitrary code execution so the attacker could effectively run any software they'd like on a user's machine. This allowed the attacker access into the operating system, and from there they could install additional malware to run the ransomware software. Another type of malicious code was the one that affected British Airways with cross-site scripting. The attackers were able to gain access to the British Airways website, and they placed 22 lines of malicious JavaScript code on the pages used to check out when purchasing a flight. This allowed the attackers to start collecting credit card information, and by the time this was discovered, approximately 380,000 victims
Bus room is open. I'll be in there for the next 40
for this
minutes.
cross-site scripting attack. And another type of malicious code was used with the Estonian Central Health Database. This is a database for the entire country of Estonia, and it was accessed using SQL injection as the malicious code. This allowed attackers access to the entire database, effectively breaching all health information for citizens of Estonia. An injection attack is a very common way to attack an application because an attacker can easily add additional malicious code to input that is going to a server or a client device. Normally, this injection attack would be stopped by the application, but occasionally you'll find an application that does not provide the proper checks of any input going into the application, and this is a perfect place for an attacker to put their own malicious code. A very common type of injection attack is a SQL injection, but there are other types that can include HTML, XML, LDAP, and other data types. A similar application attack is one called a buffer overflow. With a buffer overflow, you're adding information into a particular area of memory reserved for a variable, but you're putting more information than that variable can hold, and the extra data overflows into the buffer of memory that is next to this variable. This is another attack that is enabled because the application itself is not doing any type of checks for input into the app. This means the attacker can add much more information to the input, and the application will improperly allow that information to be written into memory. Fortunately, this is a relatively difficult exploit for an attacker to discover. There are many different variables. Memory works in different ways depending on the application and use, and very often this simply crashes the application instead of providing any functional use for the attacker. But if the attacker does find a buffer overflow that they can repeatedly use and has consistent results, then they may have a very powerful attack against this application. Some applications will allow an attacker to gather information from the network directly or from the victim's computer and replay that information to the server to gain additional access to the application. This is referred to as a replay attack. With a replay attack, the biggest challenge for the attacker is finding the information that they can use to replay back to the server. Sometimes this can be captured directly from the network using the network tap or ARP poisoning, or simply putting malware on the victim's computer. Once the attacker has a username and password hash, or they have a session ID, they can use that to replay against the server to gain access. In some situations, this is two different attack types that are being used together. You might use an on-path attack to gather information from the network, and then use the replay attack to send that information to the server. When a user logs into an application, they're often provided permissions that are appropriate for their role. A user would not commonly be granted administrator rights or higher level permissions by simply logging into the application. But of course, an attacker is looking for these elevated rights and permissions. And if there is a known vulnerability in this application or a bug that they can take advantage of, they may be able to get privilege escalation. We obviously want to limit the individuals that would have this level of access. So this is something we would commonly see from a system administrator, but we certainly don't want to have an attacker with this elevated level of access. This is a relatively common attack type, and obviously you would want to quickly patch any vulnerabilities that would allow an attacker to perform a privilege escalation. Although the best case from an attacker's perspective for a privilege escalation is to get administrator access, but it's possible that the attacker could perform a horizontal privilege escalation. With this type of privilege escalation, the attacker isn't moving to an administrator access, but instead is moving from user A access to access that user B would normally have. To block a privilege escalation, your first step is to close any vulnerabilities that might be on the system by patching the application. Then you might want to update your antivirus or anti-malware, especially with the signatures, so that they can look for known attacks that might focus on this type of privilege escalation. Some operating systems are equipped with data execution prevention, which limits what areas of memory a particular executable can run. This might also be able to block certain exploits because those exploits are not running in an area of memory specifically allocated for the application. And along those same lines, many operating systems can randomize where data may be stored within memory when the application is running. This means that each time the application runs, data may be located in a different location, which makes it more difficult for an attacker to find a vulnerability. Here's an example of a privilege escalation vulnerability. This is CVE 2023-29336. This is a Win32K elevation of privilege vulnerability, and it was announced in May of 2023. This vulnerability affected the Win32K kernel driver in Server 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, 2012 R2, and 2016, and it also affected Windows 10. If an attacker was able to take advantage of this vulnerability, they would be granted system privileges in the Windows operating system, and system privileges are the highest level of privilege you can have in the Windows operating system. Another application attack is the cross-site request attack. Cross-site requests are things that occur normally when you visit a website. For example, if you visit ProfessorMesser.com, your browser is going to load a page, and on that page is text that comes from the ProfessorMesser.com web server. Your browser might also load a video that is loaded from YouTube, and it might also have pictures and other information that might come from Instagram. All of this loads into a single screen, and from the user's perspective, it looks like all of this information is coming from one server, when in reality, all of this information on the screen is being loaded from different servers. This is a normal process that occurs when you visit almost any website. You'll also notice that this information on the screen is being loaded from all of these different servers, but there's no authentication requirement. So when this page is loaded on the ProfessorMesser.com website, Even though it includes YouTube and Instagram information, you don't have to include your YouTube username and password or your Instagram credentials. If we were to look into the code of what's really running when you visit a website, you'll see that it's separated into two different types of code. Some code will run on the web server itself, and some code will run on the client side. The client-side code that runs inside of your browser is commonly HTML or JavaScript. This is rendering all of the information inside of your browser in a way that the website administrator originally authored. There are also processes occurring on the server side or the web server side itself that the browser doesn't see. This may be the web server accepting a request from the user and processing that request with HTML and PHP. It could be transferring funds from one account to the other behind the scenes or posting information onto YouTube. This is something the server does only on its side, and your browser is not involved with any part of that process. The attackers, of course, know that some of these processes are happening on the client and some of these processes are happening on the server, and they can create attacks that take advantage of this difference between the client side and the server side. Many of these attack types consist of cross-site request forgeries. This is sometimes referred to as a one-click attack or session writing. This is abbreviated as XSRF or CSRF. We often refer to this as CSRF. This attack exists because you've logged into a website and now that website trusts your browser. The attacker also knows that your browser is trusted, and they're hoping to have your browser make requests on their behalf to a server that is already trusted. For example, if you're already logged into Facebook, the attacker may be able to create code that would cause your browser to begin posting status information on your Facebook account. Many web-based applications recognize the danger of this type of forgery, and they've already built anti-forgery techniques into the application itself. One way to provide this type of anti-forgery is to use a cryptographic token that is used whenever a request is made by the client. This way the web server knows that not only have you authenticated properly, but you're presenting the correct token to use for this particular transaction. Here's the way that an attacker might take advantage of a cross-site request forgery. We have in this example an attacker, a website visitor, and this website visitor has already authenticated to the bank's web server. The first step is the attacker is going to create a funds transfer request, but it needs to get that request into the hands of the bank site visitor. So they might send a hyperlink to a user, have them click on it. Perhaps it's included with an email, or it's included as a message that's sent separately to the user. If the victim is logged into the bank and they click one of those malicious links, there may be information sent to the web server that causes that victim's account to transfer information and money to the attacker's account. This all happens behind the scenes, and it's very common for the victim to not even realize that this transfer has taken place because they happen to click on one of those malicious links. A directory traversal is not necessarily an application vulnerability, but it is a vulnerability associated with a web server configuration. This misconfiguration allows an attacker to read or write files to a web server that are normally outside the scope of the website's directory. For example, if you looked at all of the different folders that were installed on a Windows computer, you would see folders for Windows that included program files, the Windows directory, the users directory, and others. Everything that's in gray are directories that normally would not be accessible by the web server running on this Windows machine. A user visiting the website should only be able to see and write to files that may be located in the www root directory of that server. But if this web server is not configured properly, it's possible for an attacker to gain access to other parts of this system. Sometimes the web server is configured properly, but it's a software vulnerability within the web server software that allows an attacker to use a specially crafted attack to gain access to these other directories. And of course, there might be an application running on this web server that could allow an attacker to write to other parts of this file system that are not part of the web server itself. Here's an example of a line that is in a web server log that shows a user performing a GET request for a specific web page on that server. And you can see that the URL says it's looking for www.example.com/show.asp, and you can see there are additional parameters in this URL that include ///windows/system.ini. The ... is very indicative of a directory traversal because that is the command that allows you to move backwards one directory in that particular file system. So if you happen to see someone trying to use ... whenever they're accessing files on a web server, they're probably checking to see if this server is susceptible to a directory traversal. Cryptography is a technology we use many times a day, but we often don't even think about what's happening behind the scenes. If we encrypt data and we send it out to someone else, is that information really secure? And how would we know if that information is secure? We need to investigate how the cryptography works to be able to understand how secure it might be. With most cryptography, the piece of information that is the difference between something being secure and insecure is the key that's being used during the encryption process. But very often, the attackers don't have access to your encryption or decryption key, and they have to find other means to be able to gain access to that data. Instead of trying to find the key to the safe, they'll instead start attacking the safe itself. So we have to examine the cryptography that we're using to make sure that it is secure and can't be attacked in any other way. One interesting part of cryptography is we tend to make these protocols and algorithms public so that everyone can examine exactly the way this cryptography works. This also means that we should be able to find weaknesses or workarounds within the cryptography that would allow us access to the data without the key. Of course, if we do find a workaround, we immediately choose not to use that cryptography any longer. This means that the cryptography we use today has withstood the test of time, and we can continue to trust these algorithms to protect our data. Since we know the algorithms are secure, the attackers now focus on the implementation of the cryptography, and very often it's the incorrect implementation of the cryptography that ultimately provides the weakest link that allows the attacker to gain access to our data. Let's first look at attacks that we can do against the algorithms themselves. The first attack type we'll look at is a birthday attack. And here's the question. In a classroom of 23 students, what is the chance of 2 students sharing a birthday? The answer is about 50%. That means if you've got 23 students in a room, you've got a 50-50 chance of someone in that room sharing their birthday with someone else. Remember, we're not asking if one student is sharing their birthday with anyone in the room. We're trying to find out if any student is sharing their birthday with anyone else. That means if you increase the number of students to about 30, the chance goes up to 70%. In the world of cryptography, the same thing applies except on a much larger scale. We refer to this birthday attack as being a hash collision, where you have 2 different plain texts and they both result in exactly the same hash. This is usually found through a brute force process, which means that you would have to try every possible plain text and compare it to every resulting hash to see if you ever have any duplicates. One way to prevent the attacker from using this method of finding multiple identical hashes is to use a very large hash output size. The larger the hash, the more difficult it will be to duplicate that specific hash. Ideally, if we have 2 different plain texts, we should have 2 different hashes. If we have a single hash that is exactly the same across 2 different plain texts, then we have a collision. Unfortunately, this is exactly the situation we found with the MD5 hashing algorithm. This is the Message Digest Algorithm 5. This was first published in April of 1992, and researchers found collisions in 1996. This became much more important in December of 2008 when researchers created a certificate from a CA that appeared legitimate when the MD5 hash was validated. This means they were able to create a certificate that was digitally signed by a certificate authority, but in reality, this had never been signed by the CA. So the industry very quickly realized that MD5 would not be a good hashing algorithm to use in the future, and we very quickly transitioned to using different types of hashing algorithms. Here's what a hash collision really looks like. I have 2 types of plain text that I'm going to put into an MD5 hashing algorithm. And you can see that the plain texts are almost identical. You can see they both start with delta 131 delta delta, and everything that is the black letters are identical between both of those plain texts. But there are minor differences between the plain text. You can see that the letters that have a bold red are different between both of those plain texts. Because these are different, we would expect the resulting hash to also be very different. But if you put both of these plain texts into the MD5 algorithm, you end up with exactly the same hash, which means we found a collision. In our previous example, it was the MD5 algorithm itself that had shortcomings that would create these hash collisions. But earlier, I also mentioned that it's the implementation of the cryptography that can often create these types of attacks. For example, the downgrade attack is an attack type that uses a perfectly secure algorithm, but it's the implementation of the algorithm that creates the attack. The purpose of a downgrade attack is for the two devices that are trying to send encrypted data to either use a weaker encryption algorithm or not encrypt any of the data at all. One common form of a downgrade attack is SSL stripping. This is a combination of an on-path attack, so you're sitting in the middle of a conversation, and because you're sitting in the middle of the conversation, you're able to perform a downgrade attack. Like most on-path attacks, this can be challenging to be able to implement because the attacker really does need to be in the middle of the conversation. But if the attacker is able to sit in the middle of this conversation, it can send back information to the victim's browser page that the page that they're trying to visit really is not encrypted, so you don't need to request an encrypted form of the page. Simply send all of the data across the network without any type of encryption. This means the victim will use the non-encrypted HTTP protocol rather than the more secure encrypted HTTPS. Here's how SSL stripping works. Normally, you would have a website visitor that communicates directly to a web server. But with SSL stripping, there is an on-path attack. So there's an attacker that sits in the middle of this conversation that normally would not be there. It's this attacker in the middle who's stripping out the encryption part of the HTTPS to provide simply HTTP to the victim. Let's go through the steps that a website visitor might use to log into a web server. Let's include the attacker in the middle to do the SSL stripping. The first step is for the website visitor to send a GET request to the web server. This GET request would include HTTP instead of HTTPS, which starts the process of the HTTP stripping. This request is made over HTTP and not HTTPS. Although normally this is changed by the web server, the initial request being made with HTTP means that the attacker can now take advantage of SSL stripping. The attacker will act as a proxy in the middle of this conversation, and for the very first request, which is that HTTP request, it will simply pass through that request to the web server. The web server recognizes that this request is being made in the clear. There's no encryption because the user is using HTTP. So it will send a message back to the user saying, let's use a different web page that includes HTTPS. Obviously, the attacker doesn't want that information to get to the user, so it simply doesn't send that answer back to the user's workstation. Instead, the attacker sends a second request to the web server, but this one has the HTTPS included as part of the conversation. Since the attacker is the one initiating this conversation, it has complete access to all of the data that would go back and forth over that encrypted connection. So the web server sees the proper request is being made to the HTTPS page, and it sends back an OK message saying, everything looks great. The attacker then sends the OK message to the website visitor. That's the response to the initial GET that occurred. And notice that that is sent over HTTP and not the original HTTPS. The second step would be for the user to log in. So they'll send their username and password information, but again, they're sending it over HTTP because they were never redirected to HTTPS. The attacker sees this information being sent, can read everything in the request, including the username and password, and simply uses that username and password to log into the web server with the appropriate HTTPS. The web server responds with an acknowledgement that the login was successful, and the attacker simply passes that acknowledgement back down to the visitor. From this point on, all subsequent communication will take place in the clear between the website visitor and the attacker, and of course all of the information between the attacker and the web server will continue to run over the encrypted HTTPS. This means that anything that is sent back and forth between the visitor and the web server will always be captured, viewed, in some cases modified by the attacker sitting in the middle of this SSL stripping. In your IT career, there is a possibility that you could run across an application that stores credentials like usernames and passwords in a non-encrypted form. We often refer to this as in the clear. Although this is rare, this is something that could be a significant security concern. This is why we always say to never store passwords as the plain text of the password. Someone can gain access to the files or databases where those credentials are stored, and at that point, they would easily have everyone's username and password in plain text, and they can begin taking advantage of that information immediately. If you're using an application that is storing this information as plain text, your only good option is to stop using that application. Perhaps reaching out to the application developer might be an option, but this will require a rewrite to be able to save your passwords in a form that's more secure. Instead of storing these passwords as plain text, all of these passwords should be stored as a hash. We've discussed an overview of hashing in previous videos. In this video, I want to drill down into how hashes and passwords are so closely related. When we're storing information as a hash, we're taking a variable length input and representing it as a fixed length string of text. You'll often hear this referred to as a message digest or a fingerprint. Another interesting characteristic of hashing is if you have a different input into the hashing algorithm, you will have a very different output. This means that everyone with a different password will have a very different hash that is stored in the database. And perhaps from a password perspective, the most important characteristic is there's no way to reverse engineer the password once it's stored as a hash. Just as the fingerprints on your hand can't be used to reconstruct an entire person, you can't somehow reconstruct a password when you only have the hash of that password. Here's an example of what these passwords would look like if we stored them with a hash instead of storing them with the plain text. On the left side of this list are the passwords, and on the right side is a hash that's been created with the SHA-256 hashing algorithm. You can see that the password of 123456 is stored as this hash, and the password of 12345667 appears to be a very different hash. Notice that although the password itself is only one character difference between the two different hashes are very different from each other. If we were to look at the section of an operating system or the file where these credentials are saved, you may be able to see the usernames associated with these accounts, but notice that the hash that is stored for each one of these accounts is very different from each other, and none of it contains the original plain text. You may have run into a scenario where you've forgotten your password and you try a number of different options for logging in, but after the fourth or fifth try of an incorrect password, your account is locked out, sometimes for a certain amount of time, or sometimes you would need to call to have this account re-enabled. The attackers would love to try guessing at what your password might be, but they don't want to guess so many times that they also might cause a lockout. So instead, they might try the most common passwords. This is a list of the top 5 most common passwords as found on Wikipedia, and they're passwords you might expect. Passwords like 123456, 1234567889, QWERTY, password, and 12345667. Although it may seem obvious that people shouldn't use these types of passwords, unfortunately, people all too commonly use these very common passwords when securing their accounts. So all an attacker would need to do is to try perhaps maybe the top 3 passwords on this list, and if they don't gain access to the account, they'll simply move on to the next one on their list. So the attacker will try to find these accounts that have very weak passwords, and it might try 3 attempts. And once it uses those 3 attempts, it moves on to the next account. This means there won't be any lockouts, there won't be any alarms or notices in a security report, and they can effectively try this online brute force attack without raising any type of notice. We refer to this type of attack as a spraying attack, and if an attacker wants to simply find those accounts that might be available using these common passwords, this is a good way to accomplish that without raising any suspicion. You can think of a spraying attack as the beginnings of what could potentially be a brute force attack. But a brute force attack would be trying many different iterations of passwords to try to find the right one. In many cases, the attackers will go through every possible combination of letters, numbers, and special characters until they can find every password in that password list. As you can imagine, stepping through every possible iteration of a password is very time-consuming. And if the hashes have been saved with a strong hashing algorithm and the passwords themselves are quite long, this could take quite a bit of time to brute force. Here's the process that an attacker goes through when trying to brute force a password. They have already received the hash. They might have received this as part of a file that was downloaded, or they were able to obtain the hash in other ways. This hash doesn't contain any information that can tell us what the password is. So we'll now start the brute force. We'll start with the password AAAAA, and we'll look at the hash for that password. If that hash matches the hash that was from our password file, then we've just found the right password. In this particular case, it does not, so we will go to the next possible iteration, which is AAAAB. We can see that that hash also does not match the password. We'll go to the next one on our list, and we'll keep iterating through every possible combination. Eventually, the attacker will come across a hash that finally matches the hash that was stored in the password file. In this particular case, the password that the attacker was looking for is literally the word password. As we've already mentioned, it's very common for accounts to automatically lock themselves when too many incorrect password attempts are made. And that's why a brute force attack online is going to be very slow, because you'll only be able to make a request to this perhaps once or twice a day. And of course, you do have the concern that eventually this account will be locked out. Instead, the way that most attackers handle a brute force is to download the file that contains all of that password information. Very often it looks something like this, where there would be a list of usernames, perhaps a name ID or group ID, and then the hashed password itself. Once the attacker is offline, there's no concern that an account might be locked out. They can perform as many brute force attacks as they would like over whatever time frame that they would like. As long as the attacker has enough time and enough computational resources, they can try every possible hash until they come across one that matches information that's stored in the password file itself. As an IT security professional, you'll often be looking for any evidence that someone may have breached or gained access to your systems. We refer to this evidence as an indicator of compromise, or IOC. This describes a situation where you are highly confident that there has been some type of compromise to your systems. For example, you may find that there is an unusually large amount of traffic being transferred over a particular network. Or perhaps the hash values associated with files that have been stored in your system have now changed, indicating that something has been modified with those files. Perhaps most of your traffic is within your own country, but you're noticing an uptick of traffic that's coming from international sites. Or maybe the DNS information in your servers have been modified, and that could be an indication that someone is trying to manipulate where traffic can go on your network. There might also be unusual patterns when people are authenticating or logging into the network, and there may be certain files that are suddenly being read a lot more often than they might normally be. All of these situations and many more could be interpreted as an indicator of compromise, and in this video we'll step through some of these very important indicators to see what it might mean if we were to see it. One very telling indicator of compromise might be that your account has been locked out. This would be especially unusual if the account was locked because of too many attempts to log in, even though you were not the one that made those attempts. Most accounts will lock themselves automatically after a certain number of incorrect password attempts, and at that point you would need to unlock the account to allow the legitimate login. Of course, the account could have been administratively disabled, which means it wasn't a password attempt that caused that account to be locked. Someone specifically went into your management system and disabled that particular user's account. That would certainly be an indicator of compromise, especially if no one at your organization was tasked with the process of disabling that account. And this indicator might be part of a much larger plan by the attacker. They might be trying to intentionally have this account locked so they can call the help desk pretending to be the user and have the help desk reset the password on the phone with the attacker. This is another good reason why there should be very strong processes and procedures for a password reset to avoid this type of impersonation. Traditional physics tells us that if we are in one location, it's not possible for us to also be in another location at the same time. This is something we can also apply to logins and session usage on our systems. If one person is logged in from one facility and we notice that person is also logged in from a different location, that may indeed be an indicator of compromise. Of course, this may not always be the case, and this may be very difficult to track down as well. Many of us have accounts that are running on different devices simultaneously. You might have an account that's logged in on a desktop, a laptop, and a mobile device, and sometimes those devices can exist in different locations. Or this may be an automated process, perhaps a service login, and the service login is obviously not the same as an interactive login. Here's a report that I ran from my Google Mail account. It lists out all of the different types of access, the location with the IP addresses, and when this particular activity occurred. This can show me if I was the person logged in and using my Google Mail account, or if there may be an account running elsewhere that may have access to my mailbox. Once an attacker has done all of the hard work of gaining access to a system, they want to be sure that they remain in that system as long as possible. And they also know that if you're able to patch this system, you would effectively close the vulnerability and perhaps lock them out of this system that they previously had access to. This is why you'll notice that viruses and malware will tend to disable any type of updates from the antivirus software once it has infected that machine. This means the user would not be able to download any security patches or update any signatures for antivirus, which of course means that the attacker can remain on that system for as long as they need. If you're finding that you're not able to connect to certain security websites or download security patches, that could certainly be an indicator of compromise. Normally, you would think logging in, all you would need is a username, password, and any other type of authentication mechanism to gain access to a system. And indeed, most of the time that's true. But what if these logins occur in very different parts of the world? We should be able to look at all of the logons and logoffs for a particular account to see exactly where the users might be located. For example, there may be someone logging in from your corporate office in Omaha, Nebraska, right in the middle of the United States. And you notice that a few minutes later, you have another login from the same user located in Australia. This should immediately create some type of alert or alarm indicating that these two logins should not be occurring so quickly together at such a very far distance. These types of impossible logins should be something that you can easily identify by looking at the authentication logs. This would tell you when a person logs in and where they're logging in from, and that can be compared to any of the other logins occurring for that user during a particular time frame. When an attacker gets inside of your network and gains access to your systems, there's always something the attacker is doing that should allow you to track any of their progress. This is called resource consumption. For example, the attacker may be transferring files from one system to another, or transferring data out of your network and onto the attacker's servers. This would certainly show a spike in traffic, and if you happen to notice that your network is suddenly busier than it normally might be at 3 in the morning, that could be an indicator of compromise. Your firewall logs would certainly show a transfer of information associated with a flow of traffic, and you might even have IP addresses and timeframes associated with that as well. This can often be your first notification that someone may be inside of your network and transferring data from one place to the other. And there have been breaches where the only notification that something was a little unusual was one small file transfer occurring at a time when nothing else should be happening. Sometimes not being able to access a resource on your network is relatively innocuous and not something that is an IT security concern. But there are times when a resource being unavailable could be an indicator of compromise. For example, a server may suddenly be inaccessible across the network because an attacker is trying to find a vulnerability and in that process cause the server to crash. Or it may be that there's network that's being disrupted in one part of the network. This may be caused by the attacker transferring data on the network, or they may be trying to create a problem on the network so that they can run other exploits elsewhere. This attempt to exploit a vulnerability can certainly cause a server to fail, and there have been more than one case in my career where we found a system that had failed because someone tried to find a known vulnerability vulnerability in that system. If you access some data on a file system, you may find that the data is suddenly encrypted and not available. And if that's the case, you may be infected with ransomware. And as we've already mentioned, if you try to log into a server and it tells you that your account is locked, that resource will certainly be inaccessible, and it's probably locked because an attacker tried to brute force your password. In the world of IT, we try to log as much information as we can, and very often those logs may also be an indicator of compromise. For example, it might be an out-of-cycle logging, which means the log or the information contained in the log is something that should not be in that log during that particular time frame. For example, your organization probably has a change control process that manages the updates of security patches. These security patches are probably installed on a very regular schedule, and everyone knows the time and date that these security patches are commonly pushed out. But if you happen to see log information showing that patches or applications are being installed at times when you would not expect them to be there, this may be a case of out-of-cycle logging. We see this quite a bit with firewalls because firewalls tend to record every single traffic flow and all of the details associated with those traffic flows. This means that we can look at every bit of traffic traversing that firewall to understand what was sent at any particular time of the day. And if we're examining the firewall logs and notice that some information is being transferred at an unusual time frame, that may indeed be an out-of-cycle logging and an indicator of compromise. The attackers also know that there are extensive logs being stored on operating systems, workstations, firewalls, and other devices. Because of this, attackers will very often delete log information in order to hide the fact that they were on that system. Each time the attacker authenticates, transfers files, sends data through a firewall, or accesses a server, there will most likely be a log associated with those actions. This is why it's a good best practice not only to create reports based on that log information, but to also set up notifications if any of that log information is missing. This would give you some type of indication that there might be a compromise occurring on your network. And a very clear indicator of compromise is when suddenly your private organizational data is suddenly made available on the internet. It's very possible for an attacker to gain access to all of your systems, exfiltrate all of your sensitive information, and you have no idea that any of that data was even transferred. At least not until that data suddenly appears on the internet and everyone can now view this sensitive information that normally would only be private to your company. This is sometimes done in conjunction with ransomware. The attackers will embed ransomware in your environment and encrypt all of that data on your systems, but before doing that, the attackers will send all of that sensitive information to their servers. They'll then inform the victim that they're expecting a payment so that they can send the decryption key. And if you don't send any payment, they'll start releasing your private information to the public. Sometimes this information will suddenly appear on a server that's publicly available on the internet. Researchers will then need to go through the data to see if they can discover where this information was stolen from and contact the original owner. In order to limit the scope of any type of security event, it may be useful to segment your network into smaller pieces. This might be through physical segmentation, where you are physically separating devices. It might be logical segmentation. We often see that in network switches with VLANs, or virtual segmentation, which is very common in cloud-based or virtual machine architectures. Sometimes we separate these systems to get the best possible performance, especially if it's a high bandwidth applications. We might dedicate a single subnet just for this high bandwidth application so that it can run as efficiently as possible, and anything that's done by any other user on the network would not have any effect on the throughput of this app. Sometimes our segmentation is very strategic, especially from a security perspective. For example, you might have a rule that says users should not be communicating directly to a database server. Instead, they should be communicating to an application, and the application server should be communicating to the database server. In this situation, there might be a firewall or some type of control list that would limit who might have access to a particular server. And some segmentation is required, perhaps due to a mandate or set of policies and procedures. For example, if you're running PCI compliance, that's the payment card industry, which means you're protecting credit card numbers, you might be required to keep the credit card information completely separate from any other part of your network. It can be easy to implement this separation using an ACL, or access control list. This provides a way to allow or disallow traffic through your network, operating systems, or other technologies. So you might have a grouping of different categories like source IP address, destination IP address, port numbers, time of day, or any other detail that you can use to control traffic through a device. This access may be all based on IP address, where certain IP addresses can access other IP addresses, and there may be blocks installed for other ranges of addresses. Or maybe it's based on the user. If it's a regular user, they might not have access, but if you are an administrator or a super user, you may have the proper access to that service. It's also important when configuring these ACLs that you take all different connections into account. You don't want to create an ACL that would effectively lock you out from building other ACLs in that system. Here's an example of permissions that you might want to allow or disallow using an access control list. For example, you might have a rule that says that Bob can read files on a particular resource, Fred can access the network, and then James can access the network 192.168.1.0/24 using only the TCP ports 80, 443, and 8088. You can see this last control is relatively specific, which allows the administrator to create very granular controls for access. ACLs are also found in our operating systems. If you've ever configured permissions to a particular folder or file that's in an operating system, or you've created groups and added users to those groups, then you've configured an access control list. Another form of segmentation is based on the applications you use themselves. And many operating systems allow you to create an application allow list and deny list. Many organizations will use these lists to ensure that only legitimate applications can be used on those systems, and it will block the use of any other app. This would include blocking malicious software, such as Trojan horses, malware, viruses, and others. You would generally set a rule or a security policy that would allow or disallow a particular application to run in that operating system. There are two different philosophies for allow lists and deny lists. You might set up an allow list where nothing runs unless it is specifically approved, which means you would have a relatively restricted list. Only what's on the list is able to run on that system. In other environments, you might have more flexibility with a deny list. Deny list works the opposite of an allow list, where nothing that's on that bad list can be executed on that system. That means that everything can run except the things that you have specifically written as being unable to run on that system. A good example of a deny list is the antivirus or anti-malware systems that you're already using, which allow everything to work through your system until it identifies a known bad virus or malware, and then it will block that particular application from working. Windows provides extensive controls for allowing what applications can run, what applications are denied. This can be done with an application hash, where an application can be identified not with its name, but with a very specific hash associated with the application itself. That means if something changes with the application, the hash will no longer match, and it will not apply to this particular rule. Some applications are digitally signed, so there's a certificate you can reference on who signed this particular app. So if an application is from Microsoft, Adobe, Google, or any other organization with a signed app, you might set a rule that says if it's digitally signed, it's allowed, and if it's not digitally signed, it won't run on the system. Windows also allows you to allow or disallow applications that are running from a very specific area of the drive. And if an application is running from a different directory on that system, you can configure a rule to prevent that application from running. And of course, Windows has the concept of network zones, where you might be on a private network or a public network, and you can set rules inside of Windows that would allow certain applications to work depending on what zone you happen to be located in at that time. Mitigation is the process of reducing the impact of a security event or a potential security event. And in this video, we'll look at some of these mitigation techniques. One great way to stop an attack is well before the attack even happens, and the best way to do this is by patching any known vulnerabilities. This will not only keep your system more secure, occasionally will also keep your system more stable. Organizations like Microsoft create a series of patches every month that you can then push out to keep all of your systems up to date with the latest security patches. You might also get security patches from application developers or device manufacturers to make sure that those devices are also secure. And you may find that your operating systems at home patch themselves automatically. It's built into the operating system to constantly check to see if new patches are available, and if they are, it will download them and install them without any type of user intervention. In a large organization, however, this might not be an automated process. Instead, the information technology department may test the patches first, and only once they know that they're working properly do they push them out to everybody else's system. And although some of these patches arrive on regular intervals, there may be times when an emergency patch is pushed out, especially if it's a significant vulnerability and the attackers are actively taking advantage of this unpatched opening. Another way to mitigate these security events is to limit how much data an attacker can get their hands on. Many file systems include encryption as part of the file system itself. It's integrated into the operating system. So you can select the file or the folder and have the operating system only encrypt that specific piece of data. In Windows, you might see this file level encryption referred to as EFS. That refers to the encrypting file system that is integrated into the Windows operating system. If there are devices that are leaving your building and you're concerned that someone might have access to the storage drives on those systems, you might want to enable full disk encryption, or FDE. This will encrypt everything on that storage volume, including the operating system and the user files. In Windows, you can enable this with BitLocker. macOS uses File Vault. There's other technologies available for almost any operating system. Some applications don't assume that file system or full disk encryption is even in place and will encrypt data itself inside of the application. This ensures that regardless of the type of encryption being used, the application data will always be protected. In order to identify these security events, it's important to have constant monitoring and be able to log all of the information that's occurring on your network. Monitoring can be done using technologies built into switches, routers, and other devices, or you might have a separate sensor that sits external to those devices. Many security devices will include this type of monitoring, so if you're running a firewall or intrusion prevention system, or an operating system where authentication is occurring, all of this log information is stored automatically in the operating system. Many times these logs are spread across many different systems, so it can be useful to have all of those log files consolidated back to one central source. Very often we use a SIEM, or Security Information and Event Manager, to consolidate all of those logs and provide a central source for creating reports and monitoring data. If you look around at the rights and permissions assigned to users in your company, you may find that there are very few of them with administrative access. That's because most organizations use the best practice of least privilege. This means that the rights and permissions assigned to a user are limited to the specific job role for that individual. They don't need additional rights and permissions if their job doesn't require them to have those permissions. The best case scenario would be that no user runs with administrative permissions. If you need additional rights, you can elevate permissions temporarily and then bring those rights back down to normal permissions when you're done. If malicious software or an attack occurred on that particular user's account, the access would be limited to only what that user can see. This can limit the scope of an attack or a data breach, and it could be a significant difference between an attacker gaining access to a little bit of data and all of the company's data. Another good idea is to enforce the configuration of the systems that are connecting to your network. We would commonly do this during a login process and perform a posture assessment. This checks your system to see if you're running the latest version of the operating system, if you've installed the latest patches, if your antivirus is up to date, and checks for other security features as well. This might check to see if you're running the latest version of an operating system, including all of the most recent patches, This might also check for the EDR or endpoint detection and response version. Make sure you're up to date with the latest signatures. This might check to see if your local firewall and EDR are configured and turned on properly. And it might even check for a certificate to see if your system that's connecting is really one that is trusted by the organization. If any of those settings are not up to date with the configuration that's expected, your system may be quarantined or set into a private VLAN where you can make changes to bring it up to date with the latest configurations. Once those changes are made, you can try logging in again, have the posture assessment complete, and if everything is working properly, you would now have access to the network. When we are past the usable lifetime of a piece of equipment, we often put it in the corner or forget about using it at all. But there may be sensitive information on that device that we need to remove before completing the decommissioning process. This is often associated with a storage drive. So if you have an SSD, a hard drive, a USB drive, or any other storage device, you may want to remove that or delete all information from that storage drive before decommissioning this equipment. If this decommissioned device has an SSD and you want to use that SSD for another system within your own organization, you can simply move that from one system to another. You may need to format that drive before moving it into another system, but at least you can recycle some of those storage drives. If that storage drive is no longer needed and you feel there might be sensitive information still on that drive, it might be a better idea to simply destroy the drive itself, which would certainly prevent anyone from gaining access to that data. If you take a look around your network, your servers, and other devices, you may find opportunities to make those devices just a little bit more secure. And in this video, we'll go through a number of hardening techniques. Let's start with a server. The system hardening refers to the operating system that's running on this server. Operating systems like Windows, Linux, Mac OS, and others are very different, but there are some best practices to ensure that these operating systems remain secure. One of the first most significant steps for keeping these systems hardened is to always apply the security updates. These would be updates to the operating system and security patches that are usually included with those. Manufacturers like Microsoft will release these patches every month, and other manufacturers follow a similar schedule. You should also make sure that the user accounts on these systems are well secured. One of the ways to do that is with a password policy. You could set a rule that says that there should be a certain minimum password length and there should be a certain complexity associated with those passwords. For example, your password should be at least 8 characters long, and the password itself should include uppercase characters, lowercase characters, numbers, and special characters. Another good idea is to have limited access for these accounts. Not every account on the system should be an administrator, and each individual user account should only have the rights and permissions necessary for that user to do their job. If you're accessing this device across the network, it's also a good best practice to limit who may have access to this particular system. You might include an IP address range that's permitted to access this server. And if someone tries to access this server from a different IP address, they would be denied access. And of course, it's always good to monitor and secure the system with antivirus, anti-malware, or some other type of endpoint detection. Another good hardening technique is to encrypt any data that you would like to protect on these systems. One way to do this is with the file system itself. You can select individual files or folders and tell the operating system to only encrypt that specific data. This is easily done using things like the Windows Encrypting File System, or EFS. If you would like to secure the entire drive with operating system, user documents, and anything else that's stored on this system, you might want to use FDE, or full disk encryption. This does encrypt everything that is stored on a particular volume, and you can do this with built-in tools like Windows BitLocker or the FileVault utility in Mac OS. And if you're communicating between devices across the network, you might also encrypt all of your network traffic. This can be done using a virtual private networking option, or VPN, and the applications that you're using may have encryption built into those applications already. For example, if you're connecting to other devices from your browser, you're probably using HTTPS on that address bar, and that encrypts all of the data between that browser and the web server. It's common these days for people to have 2, 3, or even more devices that they might use throughout the day. And we also need to think about how to harden each of these individual user endpoints. We're of course concerned about attacks that may be inbound to any of these devices. There could be someone on the internet trying to access those devices directly. If a device does become infected with malware, it's possible that that malware may try to attack other systems using the user workstation as the starting point. We need to think about the type of security that we might put on a desktop computer, a laptop computer, or even the mobile tablets or mobile phones. All of these are probably running different operating systems, using different applications, and we need to apply the proper security for each individual platform. And of course, there's never one single option or button to push to enable or disable security. You need to use many different types of security tools and utilities, and all of those work together to provide defense in depth. It's estimated that there are over 1 million malware variants created every day. To address this scalability problem, the industry is focusing on the next generation of malware detection through an EDR, that stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. EDR can certainly recognize known malware and vulnerabilities based on a signature, but it goes beyond signatures to provide additional security. For example, the EDR could use behavioral analysis, watching what the user does, watching what the applications do, and identifying when something malicious may be occurring, even though it may not have a signature for that particular piece of malware. EDR might also include machine learning for rapid identification of malware and malicious software, and process monitoring can constantly watch all of the processes running on your system, and if a new process suddenly began on your system, EDR can recognize that process and begin monitoring it for any type of malicious activity. EDR also has the ability to go much further than a traditional antivirus or anti-malware application. For example, the EDR itself can perform root cause analysis on the threats that it's seeing. Once EDR recognizes something that could be malicious, it begins performing additional studies on what that particular process might be. And after doing some research, it can make a decision whether that is something that is malicious or something that should be allowed. And once malicious code is recognized, the EDR itself can immediately take action. You don't need to wait for a technician or a help desk ticket to be created. Instead, EDR will isolate this system, quarantine that threat, and even roll back to a previous config to remove that virus from the system. This entire process can be automated through the use of an application programming interface or API. So the EDR can perform all of its functions autonomously and then report all of that information back to a central management console. It's very common these days to have a host-based firewall running on your operating system. This is a software-based firewall that runs behind the scenes and provides a way to allow or disallow certain traffic flows both inbound and outbound from your system. Since this software-based firewall is sitting on your operating system itself, it gets to see all of the data before or after encryption has occurred. So it has complete visibility to what might be going on, and it can decide which processes should be allowed to communicate on the network and which processes should be blocked. This is also a great place to monitor for unknown processes that may have been launched because of malware or some type of security vulnerability. And if the host-based firewall sees something unusual, it can be configured to automatically block that traffic until it's administratively approved by the user. The software-based firewall is running on each individual system that can be managed from one central console. It's very common to look for known attack types on the network by running an intrusion prevention system, but there are also host-based intrusion prevention systems that can provide this type of security on each individual device. This is often built into your EDR or your anti-malware software, and it watches all of the traffic that is inbound to your system to look for anything that might be a known vulnerability. The host-based IPS or HIPS can also secure application configurations and operating system configs, and it can look for and verify any inbound updates for securing that system. We commonly associate intrusion prevention with looking for some type of malicious action. So this might be something based on signatures that are stored in the IPS. It might be based on heuristics or behavioral changes. Since the IPS is on the operating system itself, it can extend this visibility into the way the operating system is working. For example, if the host-based IPS recognizes a buffer overflow or registry change, or perhaps some files were modified in the core Windows operating system folder, it can send an alert and block that particular process from continuing. Each time you install an outward-facing service on a server or workstation, ports are open inside of the operating system, and those ports can be accessed across the network. Ideally, you should close as many of these ports as possible. Each one of those ports is an opportunity for an attacker to find a vulnerability that will allow them to gain access to that system. This control of open ports can certainly be done on the server or workstation itself. You can also install a firewall to provide this port-based protection. Ideally, you can even use a next-generation firewall to provide much more granularity of not just the port number, but the service that's using that port number. Sometimes these ports are open without the knowledge of the end user. When you initially install an operating system or you install additional applications onto that operating system, you could be unknowingly opening ports in that system. And there are cases that I've documented that show an application manufacturer saying that you can install this application, but once this application is installed, you need to open port 0 through 65,535. This would effectively open every port on that particular server, which would certainly not be the best practice for a secure system. If you see an example like this for software that you're installing, it's not because the software needs to have all of these ports open, but they'd rather not be called if there happens to be an issue communicating across the network to the port number used by the application. And if you're not sure which ports are open and which ports are closed on your system, you can run a scan. Nmap is a great tool for scanning available port numbers on a system, and after a few minutes, it can give you a great deal of information about exactly what ports might be open on an individual system. If you install a router, a switch, a firewall, an access point, or almost any other device, there will be a default configuration screen that allows you to set the settings in that device. These management interfaces might also be found in applications that you've installed on a system, and all of these might contain very sensitive data and certainly information that would be interesting to an attacker. Normally, when you would first log in to one of these management consoles, it will prompt you to change the password, but not all systems provide that prompt. So it's important that you manually go into these devices and change the default configuration. The attackers can very easily find what the default settings are for a username and password. You want to be sure that all of your systems are secured against that type of attack. And in some cases, you can configure multi-factor authentication or perhaps centralized authentication that synchronizes with all the accounts in your network. Every piece of software that you use on a system has some type of bug inside of it. This may not be a bug that you found yet, but eventually you may find something that is a security vulnerability built into this software. And of course, you may have installed tens or hundreds of different applications on your system, and each one of those applications probably has a different process for performing security updates. This makes it very challenging to keep these applications up to date and secure, because you would have to go into every single application with their unique update process to ensure that everything is always running the latest version. Instead, the best practice might be to delete any applications that you're no longer using. This would certainly remove any security concerns, and if you're not using the application anyway, you certainly don't need to have it loaded on that system. This is a relatively easy fix, and it allows you to remove one more application from the list of keeping everything up to date on your system. At this point in the evolution of cloud technologies, it's very likely that you or your organization has one or many applications running in the cloud. These could be running as infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, or one of the many other types of services available in cloud-based infrastructures. But in all of these cases, the question still remains, who is responsible for the security for all of these different cloud-based systems? Fortunately, if you're working with a public cloud provider, they are probably going to provide you with a matrix of responsibilities. This will clearly show who's responsible for the different aspects of the technologies running in the cloud. Not all cloud providers provide the same matrix. There may be differences depending on the cloud provider that you're using. And you might have a contract with a cloud provider that modifies the default matrix of responsibilities to better fit the needs of that contract. This is a responsibility matrix that was taken from a large cloud provider. You can see that it's broken up by software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and on-prem or on-premises. Anything in blue is managed by the customer, and anything in yellow is managed by the cloud provider. In some cases, there's an overlap where both the customer and the provider are responsible for everything at that level. So for this cloud provider, if you're wondering who's responsible for the operating system, if this is software as a service, it's the provider, platform as a service is the provider, and infrastructure as a service, and obviously on-premises would be the responsibility of the customer. You can compare that with a section of the matrix for accounts and identities. That would obviously have a significant security concern. In the case of this cloud provider, the customer is always responsible for anything associated with their accounts. If you're wondering what the responsibility matrix might be for your cloud provider, they probably already have it documented as part of their services. In some organizations, one cloud isn't enough. You may have multiple clouds that you're using across different cloud providers. We refer to this as a hybrid cloud, and although it adds additional flexibility when you're using different cloud providers, it also includes an extra level of complexity when you're needing to manage across those providers. For example, most cloud providers don't talk to each other directly, and in fact, many of the systems between different cloud providers may work in very different ways. So you might have to manually configure all of your settings separately for each cloud provider. For example, you might have authentication that needs to occur, and if you're configuring it differently on each provider, you may have a mismatch between one provider and another. Or you may be configuring server configurations or firewall settings, and all of those need to match between all of these different providers. And since they're not connected to each other, it's an opportunity to have a mismatch between one and the other. It can also be difficult to manage security and other logs between these different providers. Each provider writes a different type of log with different terminology. It may be difficult to combine those together to see what's going on. And in order to take advantage of this hybrid cloud, it may be perfectly normal for data to constantly be transferred from one cloud provider to the other. Each time this data is sent from one provider to another, it's traversing the public internet. So you have to make sure that all of your security settings are configured to protect that data in transit. When working with the cloud, you're most likely working with the cloud provider. But there are also third parties for applications and other cloud-based devices that you also have to manage. For example, you might have an application you've written in-house and you've posted that application to the cloud, but you would like to put a firewall in front of that application to provide additional security. You're most likely using a firewall from a third party to provide that security. A good best practice is to have a vendor risk management policy so that you can manage and maintain the security for these third-party technologies. We also have to think about how we'll handle incident response for all of these third-party products and technologies. We certainly have our own internal processes, and we have the processes associated with the cloud provider, but we also have to bring in all of these other third parties to participate in this incident response process. And of course, we need to constantly monitor these third-party processes and devices. We want to be sure that the security of these systems and the availability is always working as expected for these cloud-based systems. Cloud-based infrastructures almost always require some type of infrastructure as code. This is a way to describe an application instance or a portion of the infrastructure in the cloud, but you're defining it as code rather than defining it as a particular piece of hardware. For example, your infrastructure as code may define what hosts need to be built, the type of web servers that are running on these hosts, and database servers that would also be used for this infrastructure. This allows you to easily build out an infrastructure, and it also allows you to easily modify the infrastructure so that you can change the configuration as needed. You can build this out in the code itself, so the next time this code is used to build out the infrastructure, it takes all of your changes into account. Now that you've created a perfect version of the application,
all right, we just got done with Net Plus and peeking in on the lead at 12:01.
Cloud provider at any time.
See what she
This
said.
is one of the significant benefits of cloud computing, is that you're able to create an entire infrastructure all based around one single definition of infrastructure as code. When we build out an application instance in the cloud, we often refer to different servers. But what if we could build an application instance that had no servers? This is referred to as a serverless architecture. Instead of simply accessing a single application, we are instead accessing individual functions that are handled by that application. Each function handles a small piece of the application, and anytime we need to perform one of these functions, we address that part of the serverless architecture. What's also interesting in this serverless architecture is there's much less emphasis on the operating system itself. Each one of these smaller application functions can run in whatever operating system happens to be appropriate at that particular time. From the application's perspective, we're only interested in sending and receiving information for that small piece of those autonomous functions. We don't have to worry so much about what operating system is running underneath. Your application developer is going to spend time breaking the application into these smaller functions and then deploying them on the server side. This also means that you would only need to run these particular application functions when they're needed. This also saves time and money, especially on a public cloud-based infrastructure. If the application needs to access a particular function, it can be built in real time in the cloud. That function can then be referenced for the application. And if it's no longer necessary to continue to run that compute container, it can then be removed from the cloud until you need it the next time. Most of the work that's happening with a serverless architecture occurs in the cloud. So the bulk of the security associated with this application instance and the serverless architecture is all in the cloud itself. Cloud infrastructures also allow us to have extremely efficient application instances. Traditionally, we've used monolithic applications running on our desktops. We would install large applications onto our storage drives. We run all of those applications in the memory of our system, and that one big application handles all functions you need for that app. Everything about that application is running as one single executable. The user interface, the login screens, all of the business logic that you would have inside of that application all occurs on the client of that monolithic architecture. This also means that you have a large application that needs to be installed on one local machine, and if that application needs to be updated, we need to process a change control. We need to send the changes down to that particular device. It needs to be installed on that machine, and then we are able to use the newest version. In the cloud, we have the opportunity to use a more streamlined process that focuses on a microservice architecture. We're able to take advantage of microservices by using APIs. These are application programming interfaces, and it allows us to programmatically control the way that an application is working. So instead of having one single executable that handles everything for the application, you can break out individual services for the application and run them as separate instances in the cloud. All you would need to do as the client is talk to the API gateway, which would then send the request to the appropriate microservice. This greatly extends the scalability of the application. If there's a certain portion of the application that is being used more than others, you can roll out additional microservices to handle that load. This also makes it more resilient. If you happen to lose a particular microservice, the rest of the application will continue to work. And since the security is based on the microservice that's running, you can provide the proper amount of security based on the service that happens to be running. If the microservice is handling authentication, there will be a set of security processes for that. And if this microservice is reading or writing information to a database, there will be a security process associated with that microservice. One concern in networking is that it might be possible for an attacker to move from one device to another using some type of connection that previously exists. But what if you're able to isolate the devices physically? You might, for instance, have switch A and switch B, and in this scenario, we've created an air gap between both of those devices. If an attacker does find a way to get access to switch A, they would have no way to gain access also to switch B. If there is a requirement for devices on switch A to talk to devices on switch B, then there would obviously need to be some type of connectivity. This might be a direct connection, or you might be passing the data through another switch or router. This air gap can be configured for a number of different scenarios. For example, you might have all web servers in one rack and all database servers in another rack. And if you have an air gap in place, this physical isolation prevents either of those from communicating with the other. You might also see this in a managed service provider where there are many customers being managed by that single company. And for highly secure environments, the managed service provider might use this physical isolation to put one customer on one switch and another customer on a completely separate, physically isolated switch. Here's what this might look like. We have customer A on one switch and customer B on the other switch. Devices plugged into customer A switch can communicate between each other, and devices plugged into customer B switch can also communicate to each other, but notice there's no connectivity between customer A and customer B. Of course, with physical isolation, we also need two separate physical switches. And if you have 100 customers, you would need 100 switches. Obviously, this is not going to scale very well. But there are technologies built into your switches that allow for segmentation, but still have everyone connected to the same physical switch. This is using VLANs, or virtual local area networks. This allows you to configure certain interfaces on your switch as belonging to one VLAN and other interfaces on the switch as belonging to the other VLAN. VLANs cannot communicate to each other directly, so this has the same effect as having two separate physical switches. This would obviously simplify the network design, and you would need fewer switches to accomplish the same amount of segmentation. When we think about switching and routing, we often consider the physical aspects of those devices. There's interfaces we would connect to, there's a power connection, and we would send information through those devices to be able to forward traffic from one device to another. But inside those devices, there are different operations that are occurring all at the same time. We refer to these as planes of operation, and from the perspective of SDN, or software-defined networking, there are three separate planes that we'll focus on. One is the data plane, the other is the control plane, and there is the management plane. This allows us to break these devices apart into their individual functions, and when you do that, you can begin coding that as software. This is a way to take the physical world, turn it into software that can then be used in our cloud-based world. The infrastructure layer, or the data plane, is the part of the device doing the hard work. Whenever we think about switching and routing, we're talking about the process of forwarding traffic from one device to another, and that forwarding process is what's happening in the data plane. This is also where network address translation occurs, any type of encryption, trunking, or anything else relating to the networking part of forwarding data. All of this data that's being transferred from one device to another is being managed by the control plane. For example, if you're using a router to forward traffic between IP subnets, there needs to be some type of routing table inside of the router so that we know where this traffic should go. And in that scenario, the control plane is responsible for managing the routing tables and then taking action on where this data should go. This also includes any type of dynamic routing updates, network address tables, or anything else that can tell the data plane how to get data from point A to point B. And of course, at some point, you'll need to make configuration changes to this device. When you're connecting to a switch at the command line through SSH and you're making configuration changes, all of those changes are occurring in the management plane. Those changes would then dictate how the control plane manages its session tables and routing tables, and ultimately that determines how the data plane is going to forward traffic. If we look at a physical switch, we can almost pull apart where the different planes of operation exist. For example, on the front of the switch, we have a number of interfaces that we're connecting our devices to. This would be the data plane, because this is what's sending information from one device to another. The control plane handles the lookup tables and address translations that are necessary for the data plane to operate. And obviously, we'll need to connect to this device over a console or a management interface, and that all occurs at the management plane. Now we can take these three planes of operation and turn them into more of a block diagram. Here's exactly the same switch, but now we're only dealing with the data plane, control plane, and management plane in more of a block diagram. We know that our network traffic flows on the data plane of this device. We have a control of that traffic occurring in the control plane, so things like dynamic routing protocols and static routes. And the configuration of this device occurs at the management plane using SSH, SNMP, or application programming interfaces. This has allowed us to create software versions of these physical devices that we traditionally have used so that we can now use these devices in the cloud. Here's a common cloud-based configuration. We have an internet connection that's connecting to a load balancer, and that load balancer is connecting to web server A, web server B, and the database server for this application. With cloud technologies using SDN, we can now immediately build out infrastructure devices we might need. For example, in this scenario, we might want to add some firewalls. So we can add a firewall that would separate the internet from the load balancer. We might want another firewall to separate and control traffic between the web servers and the database server. We're able to click a button and dynamically create this technology in the cloud thanks to our software-defined networking. If you ask an IT professional where the safest place to store data might be, some might tell you that your on-premises infrastructure is the safest. Others might tell you a more secure environment is in the cloud. Both of these, of course, have their advantages and disadvantages when it comes to security, but of course there are many other considerations to take into account. If your security is in the cloud, then it's centralized with all of your other cloud-based services. There's no hardware that you have to support. There's no separate data center that needs to be cooled and staffed. And the third party providing the cloud-based services also provides the security. If you have your own data center, then all of your security technologies are local and on premises. But this also means that you have to support all of those systems, which of course has a cost associated with it. From the attacker's perspective, they don't care where this security happens to be. They're working to circumvent and get around this security regardless of whether it's in the cloud or on premises. If everything is in-house, then you have complete control over the decisions made with the security, the options that are available to install, and you manage the entire process. In most on-premises infrastructures, there is an IT team that handles the management and maintenance of all of these systems. The staff that's managing this on-premises security are well-trained, professional, and cost more than something that might be in the cloud. But of course, when you have your own data center, you have complete control of all of the data and all of the systems. If you want to make a change to an existing system or modify a security posture, you simply do that yourself. You don't have to call a third party or access your cloud provider to make that happen. However, if you'd like to bring additional equipment into the data center, there are obviously costs for purchasing the equipment, and it does take time to purchase, configure, and install this technology. In most organizations, the technology is decentralized. You might have multiple locations for your organization. You might be using multiple cloud providers, and of course, there's more than one operating system that's running on all of these systems in your environment. From a security perspective, this becomes challenging to manage. Having all of these different systems in so many different places create a challenge for IT professionals to maintain the security of their data and applications. To address these challenges, many security professionals will create a consolidated management view of all of their systems from one single console. This allows ongoing monitoring of every user, every device, every application, and anything else that's important to monitor from a security perspective. You might get consolidated alerts brought to a single console. There might be a consolidated log file analysis so you can easily search for information regardless of where it might be in the organization. And there might be a global process for maintaining systems and keeping everything up to date. Having this centralized point where you can view the entire organization does provide additional visibility, but it does create a single point of failure. If you lose the console, you effectively lost your visibility to what's going on with your security. And as your organization grows larger and larger, that system begins working more and more. You may need additional storage space to handle the increasing number of logs, and you might need additional CPU power to be able to manage the additional alerts and alarms that might be received. Virtualization is also a significant technology that's running in practically anyone's data center. This allows us to run Windows, Linux, and other operating systems and be able to build these systems instantly and tear them down when needed. One challenge with a virtualized environment is that each individual virtual machine needs to have its own operating system. The architecture starts with the infrastructure or the physical device that everything will run on, and then there's software that runs on top of that called the hypervisor. A hypervisor's job is to manage all of the resources between the separate virtual machines running on that system. Each virtual machine requires its own guest operating system, and on top of that guest operating system will be the applications that you need to run in your environment. Looking at this diagram, you can probably see where different inefficiencies might be. For example, let's say that every guest operating system on this hypervisor is all running exactly the same OS. Maybe this is the same Linux operating system or the same Windows operating system. Even though it's all the same OS, you still need to run 3 separate instances of that operating system, even though they're all identical to each other. To address some of these inefficiencies, some organizations are moving from a virtualized environment to a containered environment. Containerization is a way to also have multiple applications running simultaneously, all on one single piece of hardware. The container in this containerization is the applications that sit on top of the container software. That container has everything you need to be able to run that application except for the operating system. The containerization software manages this relationship between the operating system on the device and the application that's running on top of it. This effectively allows you to swap applications in and out, especially when those applications are all sharing the same host operating system. And similar to virtualization, all of these containers are isolated from one another. Each application can only see the application that's running in that individual container, which makes it very efficient to be able to remove or turn off a container and replace and add others. You'll also notice that each of these containers is referencing a single host operating system that's running on this infrastructure. So generally these apps have already been designed to run on that single host operating system, and that means that everything that's on that particular system might be running inside of Windows. You might have a separate containerization system that would support applications running in Linux. So to compare a virtualized environment versus a containerized environment, you can see they all start at the bottom with hardware that everything is running on. That is the infrastructure itself. This changes a bit as we move up through the stack. You can see that a hypervisor is what sits on top of the infrastructure in a virtualized environment. But for a containered environment, we've got a host operating system that is running on that infrastructure. On top of the host operating system is the containerization software. One of the most popular is called Docker, and that is the software that then manages all of these different apps that are running on the system. In a virtualized environment, our guest operating systems are running as separate entities on each virtual machine. There are, of course, advantages and disadvantages to both of these types of implementations, and you should find the one that works best for the types of applications and deployment model that you have. A relatively new categorization of infrastructure devices is called IoT, or Internet of Things. These are devices that are designed to be integrated into your network and support some of the features and services that you use on a day-to-day basis. For example, you might have sensors in your home or business that are monitoring the temperature and managing the heating and cooling. Or your offices may have an automatic lighting system using Internet of Things. At home, Internet of Things might look like home automation tools, garage door openers, and video doorbells. You might be wearing an Internet of Things technology if you have a smartwatch or some type of health monitor, and at work you may find that Internet of Things technologies are monitoring the air quality, they're setting the temperature, and they may be turning on and turning off the lights automatically in the workplace. IoT devices are very convenient. They provide automation and flexibility of things that normally we wouldn't have access to. But they also come at a cost, especially from a security perspective. These organizations that are designing and developing thermostats, lighting systems, video doorbells, and the like are very good at creating temperature and video doorbells, but they may not be security professionals. So we do have to think about how we would implement IoT devices in an environment that is highly secure. It only takes a single IoT device to be exploited for an attacker to have full access to the devices inside of your network. If you work in an environment where there are large pieces of machinery, then these are probably networked together using SCADA. SCADA is the supervisory control and data acquisition system. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as an industrial control system, or ICS. So if you work for a manufacturing company or in power generation, then you're probably very familiar with this type of equipment and connecting all of these devices together using SCADA. This allows the technicians to sit in a centralized control room, monitor the status of all of these pieces of equipment, and be able to make changes and modifications in the control room rather than having to physically visit every piece of equipment. One characteristic that tends to be very similar across many different organizations when it comes to SCADA is that all of these need to be completely segmented from the outside. You can imagine the security issues that could arise if someone was to gain access to power generation systems or oil refineries. This could have a dramatic impact not just on immediate power needs, but could affect it for a long period of time. This is why you'll find that many SCADA systems are some of the most secure that you'll find in the world, and for good reason. If you use Windows, Linux, or other operating systems on your desktop, your tablet, or your mobile devices, then you're using a non-deterministic operating system. That means that there's no single process that can suddenly grab all of the resources of the system and take priority. But there are some systems that need that kind of deterministic use. If you're driving an automobile using military equipment or setting up manufacturing equipment, then you're probably going to need a deterministic operating system. You may have already taken advantage of an RTOS or real-time operating system when you drive your car. If you're in a situation where you need to brake the vehicle very quickly, your entire system will suddenly focus on that braking system and make sure that you're not able to skid out of control. The anti-lock brakes kick in immediately, understand the environment that you happen to be driving in, and can safely bring you to a stop. As you can imagine, we are very sensitive to any security issues that may be associated with our real-time operating systems. We don't have the luxury of these types of operating systems able to wait around while something else is occurring in the operating system itself. We're obviously not installing antivirus or anti-malware software into our automobiles, but the same type of security concern certainly applies regardless of what system it might be. This is why those systems tend to be very self-contained, and it's very difficult to find a way in to even access the operating system in that equipment. It might also be difficult to gain access to an operating system that's running on an embedded system. An embedded system is one where the hardware and software are all created as a self-contained and purpose-built device. Sometimes we see these embedded systems working as single components that make up a much larger device. We also generally find that embedded systems are created for one sole purpose, and that's the only process that that embedded system does. This would not be a technology where different apps might be loaded, or you might pull in different capabilities from a centralized app store. Instead, these are designed to do one thing and do that one thing very efficiently. For example, the traffic lights that you see when you're out driving in your car are all controlled through an embedded system. The digital watches that we use today are very good at providing us with information on weather and time, and you'll notice that there's no direct access into an operating system on that embedded system. And in a doctor's office or a hospital, you've probably seen monitoring equipment for medical use. That is certainly a very advanced form of an embedded system. One concern that most security professionals have is maintaining the uptime and availability of their critical systems. One way to provide this uptime is through the use of high availability. This gives you a way to keep a system constantly running, even if one part of the system was to fail. This would be one step up from something that might simply be redundant. Redundant means that we have multiple systems available so that one system can be used if another one fails. But it doesn't imply that this system would always be available. You may have to pull a redundant system out of the closet, put it into the rack, power it on, configure it, and finally that system would provide some type of availability. We often refer to high availability as HA. So there may be an HA configuration for a pair of firewalls that you've installed. If one of those firewalls was to stop working, it would fail over to the other highly available firewall. Sometimes this high availability can be configured with additional efficiencies. In our last example with the firewalls, we had a primary firewall and we failed over to a backup that was simply waiting for that primary to fail. But some firewalls can be configured so that both of those systems are active all the time. And if one of those firewalls was to fail, the other would continue to work normally and all of the traffic would continue to flow without anyone knowing there was a failure. When you start designing highly available systems, you also tend to spend more money. In our previous example with the firewalls, we needed 2 separate firewalls to provide that HA capability. But if we have 2 separate firewalls, maybe we also need 2 separate network infrastructures. And if we have that, perhaps we need 2 separate power systems. You can continue to add on these systems and build out and plan for additional HA, but as you do this, there will be more and more costs associated with that. And eventually you'll get to a point where you'll need to make a business decision on whether you'll spend that additional money to be highly available or if you'll simply take the risk of that downtime.
At Granger, we're for the ones who pay attention to every little detail. The ones who fuss, tinker, and sweat the small stuff. Because you know the tiniest thing can make the biggest difference when it comes to keeping business moving. We get it. We're the same way, offering access to product experts to help you quickly and easily find what you need. So whatever your industry, you know you're always getting professional grade products. Call, click Granger.com, or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
When we connect to a website or start an application, we want to log in, run transactions, or use the capabilities of that website. We expect that those resources will be up and running, and we refer to that as availability. In the world of security, there's a bit of a nuance with availability. We want to make sure that our systems and resources are available, but we only want to be sure they're available to the right people. Information technology is very focused on availability. We spend a lot of money on purchasing redundant systems. We install very large and complex monitoring systems just so we can get information on how available our systems and resources might be. This is such an important metric that our success is often described as how much availability we've had. You'll often hear the summary of uptime described as a percentage. For example, our network has been available for 99.999% of the time over the last 12 months. Even with this emphasis on providing availability, there will still be times when a device or resource is no longer available. When that occurs, we want to know how quickly we're able to recover. This is probably one of the most common questions you'll get whenever you run into an outage or you experience downtime. The problem is it's difficult to determine just how quickly it's going to take to get everything back up and running. We have to first determine what the root cause of the outage happened to be. If hardware is our issue, we may need to replace that hardware. There's a process for that to occur. If the issue is with software, we would need to provide a patch or a fix for that software. And if there are redundant systems, we may need to install or replace those redundant components. One good measurement of resilience is MTTR, or mean time to repair. This describes the length of time that it would take to replace something that is no longer available with components that are available. Although the cost of a component or software to install in your infrastructure is not the only basis for making a decision, it's still a very important consideration. Whenever we're putting together a plan to install a particular technology, one of the very first questions we ask is, how much is this going to cost? It can be difficult to calculate this cost value because it's not any one thing. For example, we may have an initial installation cost, and that installation cost may be different depending on the platform that we're installing it on. Of course, once it's installed, it will need to be maintained, and there are certainly costs associated with maintaining that software or that resource. Those costs for maintaining may go directly to the manufacturer of the technology, or these may be internal costs that we have to cover. And of course, if something breaks or it needs to be replaced, there's a cost for doing that as well. And if you ask the accounting team how much this costs, the answer becomes much more complex. We have to consider depreciation if this is a capital expense. We have to think about the operational costs associated with this, and there most likely will be tax implications for all of those. Another important infrastructure consideration is responsiveness. When we send a request to a service, we're expecting a response back as quickly as possible. And as humans, we tend to be very sensitive if there's a delay in a response. This is a common metric associated with interactive applications where we're asking a request of a service and then we're waiting to receive the response. Responsiveness can also be challenging to quantify in some cases because there may be multiple steps that occur for a single transaction. That means that the responsiveness may vary widely depending on what is happening with that particular application. When we calculate responsiveness, we tend to look at the overall functions of an application. Some of those functions may be occurring very quickly and are very responsive, whereas others may require additional work, and it might take more time to receive a response from that app. Many of the applications we use may be subject to a different amount of usage depending on what time of the day it might be or whether it's the end of the quarter. If an application is highly used, we might want to increase the capacity of that app so that everybody can use that particular application without running into delays. We often refer to this as elasticity to describe how quickly we may be able to expand and contract the footprint of that application. You might naturally think, why wouldn't you build out the application to be the largest that it could possibly be? And the quick answer is that it costs money to have that type of scalability. One way that many organizations deal with that is to build out an application instance that matches the current load for that application. And then as more people need to use that app, we might extend or scale this application to be much larger. Sometimes this can be done automatically behind the scenes, and the end user has no idea that you're increasing scalability as the load increases. From a security perspective, we need to make sure that we're monitoring the entire application regardless of how it might scale. So we might have security tools that are able to monitor the base configuration, but we also need to extend those tools if we happen to increase the scalability and add more resources to that application instance. We often refer to applications as if they are one single thing, but in reality, there are many moving parts that make up a single application instance. For example, we might need a web server. That web server communicates with a database server. You're able to increase performance by adding a caching server, and to protect all of this, you might need a firewall. And those might be just the base components of any application instance. This may be a relatively complex implementation with tens of different components all working together. When deploying these applications, you not only need to consider the technical infrastructure, but you've also got resources on the hardware that's available. You might have certain budgets for building these out in the cloud. And of course, you always need to consider the process of change control. For many cloud-based deployments, this might be a relatively easy process. This may be completely automated through orchestration, which is a description of building out a cloud-based infrastructure automatically on demand. This is one of the significant advantages of a cloud-based infrastructure is that you can very easily and programmatically build out an entire application instance in a moment's notice. This is why project management and project planning is so important during the deployment phase. You have to consider where this particular application instance will be deployed, who will be deploying it, and any additional resources you might need. If any one of those happens to be missed, it's possible that this could delay the entire implementation. With the complexities and risk associated with today's technologies, it would not be unusual for an organization to want to transfer that risk to a third party. One common way to do this in the world of information technology is to take out cybersecurity insurance. One common use of cybersecurity insurance is to protect against ransomware. This obviously doesn't stop ransomware from occurring, but if your organization does have a financial loss based on a ransomware attack, you may be able to recoup some of that loss through cybersecurity insurance. This insurance might cover any outages that occurred during that particular security event, and if you do have some business downtime and financial losses, this might be able to provide some recovery of that financial loss. This might also help an organization to minimize the risk associated with what happens after a security event. It's not unusual for a downtime that causes financial loss to the customers to result in some type of legal proceeding. This cybersecurity insurance may be able to assist with costs associated with hiring a lawyer in dealing with that legal process. It's certainly true that the longer it takes to perform a particular task, the more money that's costing an organization. And that's why if you're trying to recover from some type of outage, you should already plan to have that outage recovery process be as efficient as possible. For example, let's take the situation of a malware infection. We know that this system has malware on it. We know that the best practice is to delete everything on that system and start over again. One way that you can do this is by reloading the operating system from the original installation media, and that might take as long as an hour. Or perhaps you've already made images of your systems and you can easily recover from an image backup in approximately 10 minutes. Although both of these recovery processes result in the same working system, one of them is much easier to process and indeed much less expensive. If you're planning on implementing a new application or a new service in your organization, you might also think about what it will take to get this system back up and running if it runs into a problem and find the easiest way to recover from that particular situation. They say that the only constant is change, and that certainly applies to the process of patch availability. We spend a great deal of time going through the patching process to fix bugs, provide security updates, or make our systems more available. Usually, once we install an operating system or an application, one of the very first things we do is check to see if there are any updates before deploying this into production. And very often, we will need to install additional patches that were released after this installation media was created. In most organizations, this is a normal part of the IT process. We know that we will get monthly patches from Microsoft, and patches will arrive from other organizations throughout the month. Our organization, of course, will need to test all of these patches, make sure that it's not going to break something that's currently working in our production environment, and then we will need to deploy those to production as quickly as possible. If you're working for an organization that doesn't seem to have an emphasis in the patching process, then you might want to reconsider your security posture as it's associated with those systems. If you're not going to patch a system or an application, you leave it open and more susceptible for some type of exploit. And from a security perspective, we want to be sure to limit any instances of a security risk. But in some cases, you might find that an organization doesn't release patches and there's no process in place to patch that particular system. We see this often with embedded systems like HVAC controls for your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or it may be time clocks. These are purpose-built systems. There's no internet access or other type of connectivity to this device, so there's no way to easily patch what's inside of that embedded system. This is relatively short-sighted these days because attackers will find any technology and find a way to exploit that technology. There may certainly be security issues associated with the software that's running on these systems, but until you find a patch, it will remain vulnerable. It might be a good idea to provide additional security around this particular device. For example, if these devices are connected to the network, you might want to have a firewall between this device and the rest of the world, only to provide another layer of security. One thing that today's technology can simply not do without is power. We must have electricity to be able to run all of these systems, whether it's something that is on premises or in the cloud. Unfortunately, we often don't think about our power infrastructure as being something that we might want to monitor. But in fact, it is one of the most important components of everything that we do in technology. It's often a good idea to bring in a licensed electrician who can look at your current power usage and give you plans for extending this power in the future. And those requirements may be quite different depending on what you're doing. For example, if you have a data center, your requirements for power will probably be very different than the power requirements for an office building. For most organizations, there is a single primary power provider for your particular geography. But if you're living in a very populous area, you might have multiple options for bringing power into your facility. But there may be times when primary power is simply not available and you may need some type of backup. In those cases, you might want to look at a UPS, which is an uninterruptible power supply, or something like a generator that can provide some or all of your organization's power requirements. In today's cloud-based environments, we tend to take the resources we need for an application instance and break them into their smallest components. One of the components that's going to provide the heavy lifting and processing is the compute component. This is something that's more than a single CPU, and in the cloud is probably called a compute engine. This is the part of the entire process that does the actual thinking and processing of the data. It might be a single processor running in a server that's in our data center, or it may be multiple processors that are located on multiple cloud-based technologies, and we're able to scale those systems to be whatever size we might need for the computing requirements of our applications. I've worked on hundreds of different networks in my career, and everyone's network tends to have unique characteristics. This makes sense because if you're working in a manufacturing environment, your network infrastructure is going to be very different than if you're working in a medical environment. But even with these dramatic differences between the overall goals of the organization, there are still parts of the network that are very similar from one network to another. We tend to use firewalls to help us segment the network and determine where we might place different devices in our network infrastructure. This can help us keep the attackers on the outside of our network while allowing legitimate traffic to pass through. But of course, the firewall is not the only security technology we might use. There are other devices that either include their own security or can help with the overall security architecture. Devices such as honeypots, jump servers, sensors on the network, and load balancers can help create a more secure computing environment. One characteristic that can help in the process of designing a secure environment is the idea of a security zone. A security zone is very different than an IP address range or subnet description. Instead, a security zone allows us to logically separate all of the devices on our network by their use or their access type. Each section of the network would be assigned a zone. For example, you might create a very basic network design where part of the network can be accessed from the outside and part of the network is prohibited from outside access. You might assign one of those zones as a trusted zone and the other as the untrusted zone. By themselves, those names don't tell us a lot.
Everybody doing okay on this side? The west side, the best side.
Internal zone, and external zone.
Y'all good?
All
Right.
Yeah.
They're in a breakout. Be Weezy, you doing good over there?
Granular security, you can have
He's like,
different
nope,
zones, some that might be called
Elaine.
inside, internet, servers,
Okay, no
databases,
problem,
or
Elaine.
screen. This makes it easier for us
Is he
to
still here or did he
understand what the
leave?
security rule
Who?
is based upon.
Oh, there he is. There you go, Elaine. Your screen popped up. What's
Yeah.
up, man?
For example, we might
You're hiding behind another square.
You're allowed to send data from a
Yeah.
trusted zone
I got
to
you.
an untrusted zone. Or you might allow access from the outside, the untrusted
All right. Good
zone
breakouts today. Good
to
studying.
a
I like that.
secluded zone, which is where our screen subnet might
Whew.
be. Or in certain circumstances, there may be
Pushing through, y'all. We pushing through.
that is allowed to move onto the
We
trusted
pushing
network.
through.
Here's
What's
how we
up,
might
Mr.
put this
Charles?
into practice. This is a network
Yes.
that has an internet connection on
We
the
pushing
outside.
through.
There's a firewall, and then there's a router.
I think we should keep these backgrounds for tomorrow. Everybody's looks pretty cool. Yeah, let's ride them out for the week. I'm gonna keep mine.
A very simple zone configuration then might be everything on the outside and everything on
Matter
the
of fact,
inside.
I'm gonna do
We
this.
might call one of those zones the untrusted zone, where the internet is, and then we would
I'm
have
actually gonna
inside
share this
the
picture since
trusted
I
zone.
took it.
Here's a similar design
Anybody
where
wants
we're
it.
using an internet zone, a screened zone, and an inside zone. And you can see
Two
that we
cool
have more
pictures I took at the
granularity
car
when we start
show.
breaking these up into
I'll
smaller
share it
zones.
with you if you want
We
to.
can set more precise security rules in all of our
One
firewalls.
picture. There you go.
An attacker is going to work very hard to find any
Yeah, the
vulnerability
breakouts went
that
good.
might be on your network. And for that
Putting
reason,
time in
we
for
should
this.
think about
Okay,
how
yep.
would an attacker get into
But if you need anything, Elaine,
Yeah,
you know you
absolutely.
grab us anytime.
Yeah.
Grab me anytime. We got you.
perhaps the basement.
So I know even though you're not in the breakouts, you probably got a system you're trying to
Yeah.
work it out. So I got you.
The authentication process itself, or simply
But we're here for you.
error. We can work very hard to make sure that we patched all of our applications and we've closed any open ports that are unnecessary on our servers. But if we've got one firewall rule that we've accidentally configured it properly, that human error could result in someone gaining access to our network. We refer to this combination of potential openings of our network as the attack surface. And our goal is to minimize the size of the possible attack surface. For example, we may want to audit any code that we're putting into our network. We might want to specifically block certain ports on our firewall, and we'll always be monitoring traffic in real time to get an idea of who's entering our network and what applications are being used. And of course, part of that attack surface is the connectivity that we build throughout our network. Of course, every device on our network tends to be connected in some way to every other device. So it's important that we integrate security into the network connectivity as well. One thing that we can do is secure the network cabling that we have in our facility. In many organizations, the cabling is simply sitting out. There are both physical and logical protections that we can apply to the network drops that are next to our desks and our conference rooms. We might also want to consider protecting the cabling as it goes between different parts of the building. If someone is able to tap into the network,
your volume is
all
up.
the traffic traversing between devices. For that reason, it's always a good idea to provide application-level encryption, so even if they are able to capture the actual packets, they have no idea what's contained inside of those packets. For our remote sites and people connecting from off-site, we may want to include additional encryption for those links. It's not unusual to build IPsec tunnels.
Your volume is up.
Concentrator so that anyone on the outside can securely connect to the corporate office.
James, I don't know if you were responding to us, but it sounds like your volume is up. I saw.
What? Am I volume off?
Yeah.
Now you can beat this lip. I've been talking to myself.
Yeah.
So when I asked Brian, Michael, stop laughing at me. Mike, stop that nonsense now. He's Charles, stop snickering. I see your hand up. Stop. Brian, wipe that smile off your face. Mr. Teaser. Yeah. So maybe now I can ask Brian. Brian, when do you want to take your no wonder he didn't hear me. When do you want to take your Net Plus? CYSA. That is funny. I'm sitting here talking to myself. Elaine's like, yo man, is your camera? James discovers audio. Just like the PBQ on the Net Plus exam. There's an infiltration on the audio driver. What do? Turn the audio driver off. This is crazy. I'll rely on y'all to get my idea. Think of this. Alright. Nothing to see here. No need to tell Jesus, Mark, what happened. No need to do that. Charles says we're here for you, James. User error.
But at least the network will remain up and running. If this is a failed closed system and device crashes,
Mike just bust up laughing at me on the screen.
the network connection will be severed.
Long story short, I'm just sitting here looking at this. Gotta be 10% smarter than that quick. We all make mistakes. I'm sitting here talking, right? And I'm like, yeah. And I wonder why everybody looked at me like. So Elaine says, James, I don't think nobody can hear you. He's sitting here talking. I'm like, oh snap, no wonder. And I'm sitting here saying, how come Brian ain't responding to me? I'm sitting here talking to myself. Golly. Oh my gosh. Yeah, we all make mistakes. It happens. Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Elaine. Appreciate it. Now, Michael, that was a clear example of the PBQ where if you turn off the audio drive, that's what happens. That's how you solve that PBQ. Okay, good. We're great. We're on the right page now. We can move on. Okay. Start the process. Oh man, this is cool. All right.
Check that.
Y'all are hilarious. So like tomorrow we'll start day. We'll be on day 6. We'll go over day 5 slides tomorrow. We gotta hit some questions tomorrow, y'all. Y'all want to play Jeopardy tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna do security plus Jeopardy.
Since the IPS is not in line with
Yep.
the normal network
Yes, and motivate. You want to do motivational quotes tomorrow too?
No, today.
Or you got one to end the day?
Today.
Today. Oh wait,
Yeah.
Elaine's about to drop one before
No,
we get
no,
out
no.
here.
Whose turn?
See what he got. Hey Zeus, we need one from you tomorrow.
Yeah, whose turn?
Motivational quote. Start us out in the morning. DJ Khaled.
Whose turn?
Whose turn? Yours.
No, I did yesterday.
You about to drop one?
No,
That's what we're waiting for.
no, I did
You can't
yesterday.
leave until you do it.
I did.
You did it yesterday?
Yeah, I did yesterday.
All right, Jesus, you got it?
and passes into the IPS IPS
dig
can
deep real quick.
identify and
Drop some
detect
knowledge.
traffic
Let's
and
go.
block them
Here we go.
immediately. At this
Brian,
point,
you got us one in the
traffic is
morning.
simply removed from the network.
First thing.
It's never sent through to the core switch. A passive monitor requires that you have some time to receiving a copy of the traffic.
Wait a minute, he did it. He just dropped it. He just dropped the mic. Sometimes motivation finds you. Let's drop the emote in the chat. Let's drop the emote. Way to go. Snap, snap, B. Snap, snap. All right, y'all. Y'all crazy. Here we go. See you in the morning. Get some sleep, rest. And as we say at the end of every show, carry out the order. Skinny dip.